Rick's been erasing Morty's memories so many times. There are numbered protocols like Scenario 3 and Scenario 4 for when it goes wrong. Phoenix Person, weaponizing decades of friendship with Rick's combat tactics and psychological vulnerabilities, memorized better than Rick knows himself. Memory. Rick choosing suicide over becoming the lonely drunk he sees in his future, because existence as a thought trapped in someone's brain is that horrifying. And those are just 3 of the deeply messed up Rick and Morty fan theories in this video. Can you imagine all the disturbing stuff there is to uncover when we dive deep into every disturbing Rick and Morty fan theory, ranked, over the next few hours? I was certainly shocked by some of the stuff I found when I made this video. So if you're ready to be blown away by what's about to come, sit back, relax, maybe pour yourself a flask of whatever Rick's drinking, or don't, that's clearly not helping him. And let's begin. The show's been setting up the perfect tragedy since literally the first season, and we've all been too busy laughing at burp jokes to notice. Phoenix Person isn't just a resurrected corpse with a dumb name. Seriously, who approved PP as an acronym? But he's a ticking time bomb made of cybernetic bird parts and government programming, and when that timer hits 0, Rick's gonna find out that having a best friend with laser eyes is way less fun when they're pointed at your face. This nightmare scenario finally comes home to roost in the most devastating way possible. Bird Person was Rick's ride or die from way back in the rebellion days. We're talking decades of friendship, the kind where you fight fascist space bugs together and presumably split the check at interdimensional Applebee's afterward. When the Galactic Federation executed Bird Person at his own wedding in The Wedding Squanchers, it broke something in Rick. Not like therapy commercial broken where you cry into your coffee and book a session with Dr. Wong. More like, I'm gonna dismantle an entire galactic government broken, which honestly tracks for Rick's personality. The Federation didn't just kill Bird Person, they Frankensteined him into Phoenix Person, which sounds cool until you remember that Frankenstein's monster spent most of that book trying to murder his creator. Look, I know the doctor was named Frankenstein, not the monster. You're very smart. Gold star. Phoenix Person isn't Bird Person with a software update. He's a weapon wrapped in the hollow shell of Rick's best friend. Like if they turned your childhood dog into a Terminator and then acted surprised when you got weirdly emotional about it. The episode shows this nightmare playing out in real time, and it goes about as well as you'd expect from a show that gave us Cronenberg monsters and suicide jokes. Rick's busy trying to save Earth from getting blown up, standard Tuesday for him, when he walks into what looks like a boss battle arena straight out of Dark Souls. The gas hissing, the dramatic footsteps, the ominous lighting. Someone on the animation team has definitely rage quit Elden Ring. And there he is, Phoenix Person, all cybernetic and terrifying, working for the very government that murdered his previous iteration. Rick tries to connect with him, calls him BP like the old days, because apparently Rick's strategy for dealing with trauma is to pretend nothing changed. Phoenix Person's response? It is now Pages, which, let's be honest, is possibly the worst superhero name since Ant-Man, but that's beside the point. Rick killed Tammy, Phoenix Person's traitorous snake of a wife, and Phoenix Person loved her? Which is wild, considering she literally murdered him, but toxic relationships gonna toxic, I guess. Then they fight. And not like a Marvel movie fight where everyone quips and nobody gets actually hurt. This is brutal. Phoenix Person is systematically dismantling Rick, and here's the kicker. Rick's trying to make jokes about it. It's funny. I always wondered who would win if we ever fought. Rick says, probably because the only way he knows how to process feelings is through sarcasm and day drinking. Phoenix Person's response cuts deeper than any laser blast. Then you were always a bad friend. Oof. That's the kind of line that would have sent Jerry's therapy puppet into early retirement. Think about what that means. Bird Person spent decades being Rick's friend, while Rick was apparently constantly running the math on whether he could take him in a fight. That's not friendship. That's the mindset of someone who's been betrayed so many times that they treat everyone like a future enemy. Which, to be fair, in Rick's case, is basically true. The fight ends with Phoenix Person about to finish Rick off before getting distracted. Does apparently even cyborg bird people can't maintain focus in this family. But the damage is done. Not the physical damage. Rick's been blown up, shot, and disintegrated more times than Kenny from South Park. The emotional damage. Rick watches his best friend, the one person who maybe understood him, trying to murder him while wearing the face Rick remembers sharing good memories with. Nothing gets resolved. Phoenix Person flies away at the end, still under someone's control, still programmed to hunt Rick, still very much alive and very much dangerous. Rick makes a joke about it, because that's what Rick does. He wraps Phoenix Person in chains and sticks him in the garage like some kind of cybernetic problem he can solve later, which is exactly the kind of emotional avoidance that Dr. Wong probably has a whole PowerPoint presentation about. Phoenix Person isn't just going to stay locked up in Rick's garage forever. That's not how Rick and Morty works. The show doesn't do neat resolutions. It does mounting dread and consequences that spiral out of control, while everyone's too busy fighting over an invisibility belt to notice the apocalypse brewing in the background. Phoenix Person has Rick's entire playbook memorized. He knows Rick's tactics, his weaknesses, his psychological tells. Then you were always a bad friend, was Phoenix Person, demonstrating that he understands Rick better than Rick understands himself. When that programming takes over again, and it will, because this show doesn't believe in permanent solutions, Phoenix Person won't just fight Rick. He'll systematically dismantle everything Rick cares about, using decades of friendship as ammunition. Rick won't be able to fight back properly. Oh, he'll try. He'll make weapons. He'll strategize. He'll probably build some kind of anti-bird defense system. But when it comes down to the actual moment, when Phoenix Person has a gun to Morty's head, or Beth's, or Summer's, Rick's gonna freeze. Because the person pulling the trigger has Bird Person's face, and somewhere in Rick's alcohol-pickled brain, he remembers drinking with that face, fighting alongside it, maybe even trusting it. Phoenix Person is the ultimate weapon against Rick Sanchez, because he weaponizes the one thing Rick tried to bury deeper than his feelings about Diane: genuine friendship. Every memory Rick has of Bird Person is now corrupted, turned into a psychological attack vector. That time they fought the Gromflamites, Phoenix Person was learning Rick's combat style. Those late-night conversations about the meaning of existence. Phoenix Person was mapping Rick's philosophical vulnerabilities. The show's been setting this up since literally episode 11 of season 1. Bird Person was introduced as Rick's moral compass, the friend who could call out Rick's bullshit without getting disintegrated for it. His death was supposed to devastate Rick, and it did. But his resurrection? That's worse than death. That's taking the one pure relationship Rick had and turning it into a weapon pointed at his skull. The programming can't be fully removed. We know this because the show went out of its way to keep Phoenix Person alive at the end of the episode. He's just dormant, like a virus in remission, waiting for the right trigger to activate again. Maybe it's a specific phrase, maybe it's a location, maybe it's just time. But when it happens, Rick's gonna have to choose between killing his best friend, for real this time, or letting Phoenix Person destroy everything he's tried to protect. The tragedy is that Rick probably saw this coming. Remember what he said? I always wondered who would win if we ever fought. Rick's been preparing for this betrayal since the beginning, which means he never actually trusted Bird Person completely. And now it has been, and Rick's going to realize that his paranoia was justified but also pointless, because knowing something terrible is coming doesn't actually help when the terrible thing is wearing your best friend's face. Phoenix Person is the final boss Rick can't beat, not because he's too strong, though he is pretty strong, cybernetic bird lasers, and all that, but because winning means killing the last good memory Rick has from before he became the person he is now. There's infinite Ricks across infinite dimensions, but there's only one Bird Person who fought alongside Rick C-137 in the Rebellion, who knew young Rick before the nihilism and alcoholism took over completely. When Phoenix Person eventually breaks free from whatever jerry-rigged solution Rick cobbles together in that garage, when his programming fully activates and he comes for Rick's family, Rick's gonna have a choice. Be a bad friend one last time and survive, or be a good friend for once and die. And knowing Rick, knowing how this show operates, knowing that Dan Harmon has built an entire career on making us watch characters we love destroy themselves, Rick's probably going to choose wrong either way. Phoenix Person doesn't need to win the fight. He's already won by forcing Rick to confront the one thing Rick can't science his way out of. The fact that caring about people makes you vulnerable, and vulnerability eventually gets exploited. The show's gonna end with Phoenix Person standing over Rick's corpse, or Rick standing over Phoenix Person's corpse, or probably something even worse that the writers haven't told us about yet. Either way, that friendship is dead. It died at Tammy and Bird Person's wedding, came back wrong, and now it's going to take Rick down with it. The most messed up part? Rick probably has the technology to completely wipe Phoenix Person's programming to bring Bird Person back for real, but he won't use it, because that would require Rick to admit he needs Bird Person back, that he misses his friend, that the loneliness is eating him alive, one alcoholic breakfast at a time. And Rick Sanchez would rather fight his zombified best friend for the rest of eternity than admit he has feelings about literally anything. That's not foreshadowing. That's a promise. And when this show makes promises about horrific emotional trauma disguised as sci-fi comedy, it always delivers. Alright, moving on to the next disturbing theory. Rick and Morty loves pulling the rug out from under us, but this theory might be the show's biggest gut punch yet. What if the guy we've been programmed to hate for 7 seasons, Rick Prime, the monster who murdered Rick's wife and daughter, was actually trying to save the multiverse from something worse? What if that something worse is our Rick, and we've been rooting for the villain this entire time? We finally get the confrontation the show's been building towards since the very beginning. Rick C-137 faces off against Rick Prime, and the whole thing plays out like the final boss battle in a video game, where you suddenly realize you picked the wrong side. Rick Prime drops some seriously weird dialogue during their fight that doesn't quite track with the pure evil villain narrative the show's been selling us. "I showed you infinity," he tells Rick. "What's your life without me?" That's not cartoon villain monologuing. That's someone pointing out cause and effect. The show's spent years establishing Rick Prime as the ultimate antagonist. This is the Rick who invented interdimensional portal travel, who offered it to Rick C-137 like the serpent offering Eve the apple, and who bombed Rick's house when he refused. That explosion killed Diane and Beth, turning Rick from a humble scientist who was ready to give up on science into the nihilistic, alcoholic genius we've been watching destroy everything he touches for 7 seasons. Standard revenge plot setup, right? The hero's family gets murdered, hero goes on decades-long quest for vengeance, hero finally gets his revenge and achieves catharsis. Except Rick and Morty doesn't do standard, and it definitely doesn't do catharsis without a side of existential horror. During their final confrontation, Rick Prime keeps saying things that sound like justification, disguised as taunting. "You would have been me," he tells Rick while getting his skull caved in. "I just walked into your garage before you walked into mine, but eventually you did. You lived in my house." That's not a villain gloating about murder. That's someone explaining that they saw the future and tried to prevent it. Rick Prime knew what Rick C-137 would become if given portal technology, because Rick Prime had already become it. Think about what we actually know about Rick C-137's journey. After Rick Prime killed his family, Rick invented portal travel on his own, proving he had the capability all along, and then spent decades systematically murdering Ricks across infinite dimensions. Not hunting, murdering. The show confirmed in Rick Mirai Jack that Rick killed so many Ricks that the Council of Ricks formed specifically to stop him. He became such a threat that infinite versions of himself had to band together and create the central finite curve just to contain the damage he was causing. Let that sink in for a second. Rick C-137 was so dangerous that he forced infinite Ricks to create a multiversal prison. The central finite curve isn't just Rick's ego project. It's a containment system built by Ricks, who were terrified of what one Rick could do when properly motivated. Rick Prime saw that potential and tried to short-circuit it by taking away Rick's motivation before Rick ever got the chance to become that monster. The Omega device is the smoking gun here. Rick Prime built a weapon that can erase someone from every dimension simultaneously. That's not just murder, that's retroactive genocide on a scale that makes Thanos look like a shoplifter. And Rick Prime used it on Diane across all infinity. Why? The show wants us to believe it was to devastate Rick C-137, but that doesn't add up. If Rick Prime just wanted to hurt Rick, killing Diane once would have been enough. Erasing her from every dimension is overkill, unless you're trying to make absolutely certain Rick can never, ever find a replacement. Because that's the thing, if Diane existed anywhere in the multiverse, Rick C-137 would have found her. He'd have portaled to a dimension with a living Diane, taken over that Rick's life, and everything would have been fine. Except Rick Prime knew that wouldn't stop Rick from becoming dangerous. It would just delay it. Maybe in those timelines, Rick's family dies some other way. Maybe Rick just gets bored and starts experimenting. The point is, Rick C-137 with portal technology always ends up as a multiversal threat. Always. Rick Prime tried to prevent that by bombing Rick's house. When that didn't work, and actually accelerated Rick's descent into omnicidal mania, Rick Prime had to escalate. He used the Omega device to erase Diane completely, removing her as a variable from every possible timeline. Then he disappeared, forcing Rick to waste decades hunting him, instead of doing whatever terrible thing Rick Prime saw in his future. Look at what Rick Prime says during the fight. "I made you." Not, "I traumatized you," or "I destroyed you." Made you. Like a craftsman discussing a project. Rick Prime is taking credit for creating Rick C-137 as we know him, and honestly, he's not wrong. Without Rick Prime's intervention, Rick would have just been a normal scientist who gave up on portal technology to raise his daughter. Maybe he would have been happy. Maybe he would have been simple Rick, the happiest Rick in existence, who the Citadel had to torture forever to harvest his joy. Or maybe Rick C-137, without Rick Prime's intervention, would have been something worse. Maybe he would have invented portal technology eventually, but without the trauma to keep him focused on revenge, he would have had free time to get really creative with his genocidal tendencies. The central finite curve exists because someone had to build it, and the show heavily implies Rick C-137 was involved in its creation. What if Rick Prime saw a timeline where Rick C-137 built the curve not as a containment system but as a hunting ground? What if the good version of Rick we've been watching is actually the neutered version, and Rick Prime spent decades making sure we never had to deal with Rick C-137 at full power? Evil Morty seems to understand something about this dynamic that neither Rick wants to admit. After Rick kills Rick Prime, Evil Morty doesn't celebrate. He asks, "How's it feel? Better? No? Exactly the same?" Like he knows killing Rick Prime won't fix anything because Rick Prime wasn't the actual problem. Evil Morty even steals the Omega device schematics and threatens to end the Rick experiment anytime I want. That's not a random threat. That's Evil Morty, recognizing that all Ricks, including our Rick, are dangerous enough to warrant extinction-level countermeasures. The episode ends with Rick completely empty. Not triumphant, not relieved, just hollow. Look on down from the bridge, plays over shots of Rick, staring at nothing, while Morty rambles about how cool the adventure was. That's not the ending of a hero's journey. That's the ending of a villain's journey. The moment when the villain realizes they've eliminated their opposite number and now has nothing to define themselves against. Rick Prime was Rick's narrative foil, the one person who could justify Rick's existence through opposition. Without him, Rick has to confront what he actually is. And what he is, potentially, is exactly what Rick Prime was trying to prevent. Rick C-137 has killed thousands of Ricks, destroyed countless dimensions, enslaved Mortys, committed genocide on the Gromflamites, and generally left a trail of destruction across the multiverse that would make Galactus nervous. The only thing keeping him from being worse is that he was distracted by his revenge quest for decades. Rick Prime gave him a target, a purpose, a reason to keep moving forward, instead of just burning everything down. Now that target is gone. Now Rick has unlimited power, unlimited intelligence, and unlimited access to infinite dimensions, with absolutely nothing to stop him. Rick Prime spent decades making sure Rick C-137 was too busy hunting him to become the real threat. And now? Now Rick Prime's containment has failed, and we're all about to find out why he thought killing Diane across infinity was the merciful option. The most disturbing part of this theory isn't that Rick Prime might have been right. It's that the show has been showing us he was right all along, and we were too busy hating him to notice. Every terrible thing Rick has done, every dimension he's destroyed, every person he's hurt, that's all happened while he was supposedly the good Rick, the one motivated by love and loss. Imagine what he's capable of now that he has nothing left to lose and no one left to chase. Rick Prime didn't kill Diane because he was evil. He killed her because he'd already seen what Rick C-137 becomes when given infinite power and infinite time. He tried to prevent it the nice way by offering Rick portal technology with a warning. When Rick refused, Rick Prime made sure Rick would never have the happy ending that might have turned him into something worse than a revenge-obsessed drunk. Rick Prime made himself into Rick's villain, so Rick would waste his potential hunting him instead of discovering his full potential. And now Evil Morty has the Omega device schematics. Rick has no purpose, and the only Rick who understood the danger Rick C-137 represented is dead. If Rick Prime was the hero trying to save the multiverse from our Rick, then that final scene isn't a victory. It's the moment the bomb finally went off. Rick Prime just took 60 years to detonate it, and we all thought we were watching a revenge story instead of a slow-motion apocalypse. Now, on to our next creepy theory. But don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Rick and Morty built its entire emotional foundation on the bond between a genius grandpa and his anxious grandson, and then spent 6 seasons quietly telling us that bond is based on a lie. The Morty we've been watching isn't Rick C-137's grandson. He can't be, because Rick's actual grandson died as a baby, along with Diane and Beth when Rick Prime bombed their house. The Morty traveling with Rick is from Rick Prime's dimension, which means every tearful moment. Every 100 years Rick and Morty. Every time Rick showed vulnerability around this kid, it was all Rick projecting his grief onto a replacement he picked up along the way like a stray dog. The show establishes its most important rule. Rick and Morty can dimension hop to escape consequences, and they've definitely done it before. The episode starts with typical Rick and Morty chaos. Morty wants a love potion for Jessica. Rick makes one using Vol DNA. Jessica has the flu. And suddenly, the entire planet wants to have sex with Morty and then eat him afterward. Standard Tuesday in this family. Rick tries to fix it with praying mantis DNA, which somehow makes it worse, then throws together a cocktail of koala, rattlesnake, chimpanzee, cactus, shark, golden retriever, and dinosaur DNA that transforms the entire human population into grotesque flesh monsters that Rick casually calls Cronenbergs. Most shows would spend an entire season dealing with the fallout of turning humanity into body horror nightmares. Rick and Morty solves it in the last 3 minutes by having Rick and Morty portal to a dimension where their alternate selves fixed the Cronenberg problem, but immediately died in an explosion. They bury their own corpses in the backyard, Morty crying and traumatized, Rick completely calm, like this is a routine oil change, and take over their lives. Roll credits over, look on down from the bridge, while the original Smith family admits they're happier without Rick and Morty around. The show treats this like a one-off solution to an impossible problem, but it's actually revealing the show's entire premise is built on identity theft. Rick's casual attitude during the burial is the tell. Morty's having a complete breakdown looking at his own mangled corpse, and Rick's just explaining dimensional theory like he's giving Morty driving directions. There's an infinite number of realities, Morty, and in a few dozen of those, I got lucky and turned everything back to normal. Rick's not shocked or disturbed by burying himself because he's done this before, multiple times. Enough times that he's got the logistics figured out and can confidently say, we get 3 or 4 more of these tops. That's not Rick estimating how many times they can do this in the future. That's Rick counting how many reality swaps he has left in his budget. You don't know the exact limit unless you've already used up some of your chances. Rick's been playing dimensional musical chairs for decades, hopping from one dead Rick's life to another, and the Morty we're watching is just the latest sidekick in a long line of replacements. The timeline doesn't work any other way. Rick C-137's wife Diane and daughter Beth died when Beth was a child. Rick Prime bombed their house, killed them both, and that's when Rick invented portal technology and went on his decades-long revenge quest. We know from Rick Mirai Jack that Rick spent years systematically murdering Ricks across dimensions, killing so many that the Council of Ricks formed specifically to stop him. Eventually, Rick gave up hunting Rick Prime, crashed into a dimension where Rick Prime had abandoned his family and moved in with that Beth. But here's the thing, that Beth was already an adult with teenage children. Rick didn't show up when Morty was a baby. He showed up when Morty was already 14 years old, meaning Rick C-137 wasn't there for Morty's birth, his childhood, any of it. The Morty traveling with Rick is Rick Prime's grandson, not Rick C-137's. Rick's original Morty died as a baby in the same explosion that killed Diane and Beth. The show confirmed this when they revealed Rick's backstory. The family photo shows Diane holding baby Beth, no Morty anywhere, because in Rick C-137's original dimension, Morty never got the chance to exist. This makes every emotional beat in the series a lie built on grief and replacement. When Rick tells Morty, "You're my grandson," he's technically correct, but spiritually full of it. That's Rick Prime's grandson. When Rick says he cares about this Morty specifically, he's projecting his dead daughter onto a Beth he never raised, and projecting his dead grandson onto a kid who's genetically related to his enemy. Rick's entire relationship with the Smith family is him playing house with Rick Prime's leftovers. The episode even shows us the dark mirror version of this dynamic. At the end, Cronenberg Rick and Cronenberg Morty portal into the now Cronenberged C-137 dimension. They're the original. Rick and Morty from the universe are Rick just abandoned, and they're thrilled because they're going to a world where everyone is Cronenberged, like us from the beginning, you know? These aren't our Rick and Morty. They're proof that Rick and Morty dimension hopping creates orphaned families and identity confusion across infinite realities. The original Smith family, Beth, Jerry, and Summer, are sitting on their porch in the Cronenberg apocalypse, and Beth admits she's finally happy now that Rick and Morty are gone. That's the show telling us Rick and Morty are objectively bad for this family. They Cronenberged the entire planet, and then abandoned everyone to deal with the consequences. But Beth and Jerry adapted, found peace, and genuinely don't miss them. Summer's doing Jaws monologues to pass the time. They've built a life in the wasteland that's better than their life was with Rick around. Meanwhile, Rick and Morty are living with a replacement family who thinks they're the originals, and nobody's bothering to correct that assumption. The new Beth, Jerry, and Summer have no idea their Rick and Morty died and got replaced. They're mourning the wrong corpses, trusting the wrong people, building relationships with identity thieves who took over their family members' lives. That's the show's big joke. Families are so interchangeable that you can swap them out and nobody notices, as long as the replacement acts familiar enough. Rick mentions in the episode that they can only do this 3 or 4 more times, which means by the show's current timeline, they're probably down to 1 or 2 reality swaps left before they run out of dimensions where convenient dead versions exist. Every time Rick and Morty have a close call, every time they barely survive, Rick's doing math in his head about whether this is the moment to cut and run to a new dimension. The show's been implying since season 1 that continuity is meaningless because Rick can always reboot to a fresh timeline. This also reframes every moment Rick shows genuine emotion about Morty. When Rick gives himself up to the Galactic Federation in The Wedding Squanchers, when he goes on a rampage and rest and Ricklaxation after Morty's detox vacation goes wrong, when he builds an entire toxic relationship out of his inability to lose Morty. All of that is Rick desperately trying to keep this replacement grandson because he already lost his real one. Rick's not protecting his Morty. He's protecting his last chance to pretend he has a Morty. The memory we see in close Rick counters of the Rick kind shows Rick holding a baby Morty, but we now know Rick C-137's original dimension didn't have a Morty who survived past infancy. That memory is either fabricated from a different Rick or from a timeline where Rick briefly lived with a baby Morty before that reality went sideways. The show deliberately made Rick's relationship with Morty chronologically impossible unless Rick's been dimension hopping and picking up Mortys along the way. The Citadel reinforces this theory by treating Mortys as interchangeable commodities. They have Morty replacement vouchers, Morty insurance, entire farms breeding Mortys for Rick consumption. The casual infrastructure around replacing Mortys only exists because Rick's regularly burn through them. Our Rick insists he's different, that he cares about his specific Morty, but he also pockets that replacement voucher in close Rick counters of the Rick kind, and has definitely swapped dimensions at least once on screen. Rick's relationship with Morty isn't special. It's just the latest iteration of a pattern Rick's been repeating for decades. This makes Rick's nihilism make perfect sense. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV. Rick's not being philosophical. He's being literal. He doesn't exist on purpose in this dimension. To Hind. He stole this life from a dead Rick. Morty doesn't belong anywhere because his real grandfather abandoned him, and a replacement moved in. Everybody's gonna die, and when they do, Rick will portal to a dimension where they're still alive and start over. Nothing matters because nothing's permanent when you can dimension hop away from consequences. The show's been building to the revelation that Rick C-137 is living a borrowed life, pretending his enemy's grandson is his own, trying to recreate a family he lost while knowing the whole thing is built on a foundation of corpses buried in backyards across infinite dimensions. Every time Rick chooses to stay with this family instead of moving on, he's choosing to keep lying. And every time Morty trusts Rick, he's trusting a man who's already buried multiple versions of him and will absolutely do it again if the situation requires a fresh start. Let's jump into the next unsettling theory. Rick and Morty might be the ultimate magic trick. 8 seasons of adventures that trick you into thinking you're watching a genius scientist travel the multiverse, when really, you're just watching a dying man's brain frantically firing neurons before the lights go out forever. Like Inception, if Christopher Nolan was too drunk to explain which level was real and which was dream. The show's already proved it has the technology to simulate entire lifetimes that feel completely real, and once you know that's possible, suddenly, every episode looks suspiciously like someone's life flashing before their eyes in the world's longest, weirdest death montage. The show does something genuinely unsettling. It demonstrates that you can live weeks or months of experiences that feel totally real, but never actually happened in baseline reality. Morty gets what he thinks is a video game save point device, because of course he does. The kid literally asked for the Futurama button, and Rick got mad about it being unoriginal. Morty goes absolutely feral with this thing. He's pulling down his teacher's pants in class, using pickup artist negging on Jessica, which, yikes, that's a whole therapy session right there, and committing suicide by cop multiple times, just because he can hit reset and try again. It's like watching someone play Grand Theft Auto, but the NPCs are people who actually matter. Then Morty has this whole beautiful relationship arc with a girl named Jerry's Mythologue. Wait, no, different episode. He meets this girl, they survive a plane crash together, casual, resort to cannibalism, as you do, trek across actual mountains to civilization, and fall genuinely in love during the whole ordeal. It's a complete romance movie, compressed into what feels like months of bonding over shared trauma and eating other passengers. The emotional beats are real, the relationship development tracks, and Morty's completely invested in this person he's building a life with. Rick reveals the horrible truth at exactly the moment calculated to cause maximum psychological damage because Rick's love language is apparently cruel irony with a side of trauma. Morty wasn't saving his place in time like a video game checkpoint. He was murdering alternate versions of himself and stealing their lives. Every single time Morty hit that button, another Morty got instantly incinerated, vaporized without warning or understanding why, so our Morty could slide into their reality and keep living consequence-free. It's the prestige, Rick announces, like he's revealing the twist in a magic trick, and not explaining that Morty's basically been serial killing himself for weeks. Here's where it gets properly disturbing. Rick explains the device works by isolating a moment in time, splitting your probable selves, and shunting you into a near-duplicate, equally probable reality, which is a lot of science words to say. You're not rewinding time, you're hopping between parallel dimensions where slightly different versions of everything happened, and also murdering yourself repeatedly. The murdered Mortys lived full lives. They had hopes, dreams, probably some English homework they were procrastinating on, and then suddenly got deleted from existence so another Morty could take over their body like a hermit crab. Those murdered Mortys experienced everything as completely real because it was real, just in a probability branch that got pruned when our Morty decided he wanted a do-over. The relationship with the plane crash girl? Real for that Morty, who lived it fully and invested genuine emotions, right up until he got incinerated, so another Morty could reset and try flirting with Jessica instead. Every consequence-free action had massive consequences for the Mortys who didn't get to hit the button. The technology exists. Rick built a handheld device that splits consciousness across probable realities, lets someone experience multiple lifetimes simultaneously, and makes fake timelines feel absolutely indistinguishable from baseline reality. If Rick can do that with what's basically a garage project he invented overnight to win an argument, healthy, then imagine what that same technology could do if applied to a dying brain. Imagine a consciousness fragmenting across infinite probability branches as it shuts down, experiencing subjective centuries while objectively dying in minutes. That's the theory. Everything we've watched for 8 seasons is Rick C-137's brain firing randomly through possibility space as he bleeds out in some garage somewhere. Maybe Rick Prime's bomb got him. Maybe he finally built that suicide helmet and used it. Maybe one of his experiments exploded, and he spent his last moments imagining what would have happened if he'd lived. Every episode is a different neural pathway, lighting up one last time. Every adventure is his dying mind, jumping between probability branches. Every emotional breakthrough is his consciousness, trying to achieve closure before the whole system shuts off forever. This explains so much about how the show handles continuity, which is to say, it doesn't handle continuity at all. Episodes happen in whatever order feels right. Characters remember or forget major events depending on what's convenient for the plot, and consequences only matter when the writers decide they matter. That's not lazy writing. Well, maybe sometimes it is. Looking at You, Season 4. But it's also exactly how a dying brain would process memory and probability. Your life doesn't flash before your eyes in neat chronological order with proper 3-act structure. It jumps around, mixes real memories with hypothetical futures, combines people you knew with people you wish you'd known differently. In the pilot episode, Rick rants about how they're gonna have adventures 100 years, Rick and Morty forever and ever, 100 times, rickandmorty.com. He's slurring and manic and sounds completely unhinged, which we all accepted as normal Rick behavior. But what if that's actually Rick's dying brain, trying to manifest infinite adventures, because the alternative is accepting that the lights are going out? The adventures never span 100 years. They span however long Rick's got before his neurons stop firing, and his brain's trying to stretch that into subjective eternity. Season 7's Unmortricken shows Rick finally achieving his decades-long revenge quest against Rick Prime, the guy who killed his wife and daughter. Rick gets what he wanted. Rick Prime's dead, crushed into paste, completely and utterly gone. And afterward, Rick's hollow, empty. How's it feel? Evil Morty asks. Better? No? Exactly the same? Rick doesn't respond because there's nothing to say. The thing that motivated him for decades turned out to be meaningless, and now he's just done. That's not philosophical disappointment. That's Rick's dying brain, realizing the neural pathways are collapsing and there's nothing left to distract from the inevitable. The episode demonstrates Rick wouldn't know he's dying. Morty had no idea he was jumping between realities, murdering alternate selves. From his perspective, he was just using a save point device. The murdered Mortys had no idea either. They were living normal lives until suddenly getting vaporized without explanation or warning. If Rick's consciousness is fragmenting across probable realities as he dies, Rick the character would experience it as normal adventures, while Rick the dying brain is just firing randomly through possibility space, trying to stay active a few more seconds. Every emotional breakthrough Rick has is his dying brain trying to achieve closure before it's too late. His relationship with Morty, processing guilt over his actual grandson dying with Diane and Beth in the original dimension. His on and off connection with the Smith family, neurons trying to imagine what would have happened if he'd been a better father, if he'd stayed, if he'd tried. His revenge quest against Rick Prime, his dying mind trying to create narrative structure out of the trauma that killed him. None of it's real. It's all just a brain, creating stories out of random electrical impulses, like how people see faces in clouds or Jesus in their toast, but significantly more depressing. The show's obsession with nothing matters suddenly tracks. Rick constantly tells Morty that love is chemicals, that nobody exists on purpose, that existence is meaningless. We all thought that was Rick being nihilistic because he's seen too much. But what if Rick's accidentally describing his own situation? He doesn't exist on purpose. He's a dying brain's hallucination. He doesn't belong anywhere, because he's just a consciousness bouncing between probability branches. Everybody's gonna die because everybody's already dead. They're all fragments of a dying man's consciousness trying to maintain coherence for a few more moments. Evil Morty's escape from the central finite curve gets way darker with this theory. Evil Morty didn't break out of Rick's multiversal prison. He broke out of Rick's dying hallucination entirely. He achieved something resembling actual existence beyond Rick's fragmenting consciousness. That's why Evil Morty keeps warning Rick not to come after him, why he threatens to end the Rick experiment with the Omega device plans he stole. If Rick the character realizes he's actually Rick the dying brain, the entire simulation collapses. All the other Ricks, all the Mortys, every character we've met, they all cease to exist the moment Rick's brain finally admits what's happening. The Vat of Acid episode ends with Morty merging all his probable realities, so only one version did all those terrible things. He lived multiple lifetimes across probability branches, murdered countless alternate selves, and then collapsed it all down to a single timeline where he has to live with the consequences. What if that's what happens when Rick finally dies? All the probability branches collapse. All 8 seasons of adventures that felt real but existed in quantum superposition suddenly resolve into a single moment, and Rick realizes in his final instant that none of it was real. Every relationship, every adventure, every moment of growth or connection, just a dying brain's last desperate attempt to keep firing. The show ending would literally be Rick's brain shutting off. The last episode wouldn't have satisfying closure, or emotional catharsis, or a neat bow wrapped around everything. It would just stop. Mid-sentence, mid-adventure, mid-thought, because that's when the last neuron stopped firing. Whatever Rick's doing when the show ends is what he was thinking about when he actually died. Maybe he's with Morty on some adventure. Maybe he's alone in his garage working on something. Maybe he's finally achieving some kind of peace. Doesn't matter though, it was all hallucination anyway. Neurons firing randomly while a body somewhere goes cold. The Vat of Acid proves Rick can create technology that makes completely fake experiences feel totally real. That fragments consciousness across probability branches. That lets you live multiple simultaneous lifetimes while your baseline self continues on unaware. Morty experienced months or years of subjective time in what was objectively a few weeks. Lived through genuine trauma and love and loss. All in probability branches that never really happened, but felt indistinguishable from reality. If Rick can do that to Morty with a handheld device he built overnight in his garage to win an argument, imagine what his consciousness is doing to itself as it dies. 8 seasons isn't a long-running animated series. 8 seasons is how long Rick's brain has been trying to process his own death, fragmenting across infinite probability branches to avoid accepting that the adventure's over. We haven't been watching Rick and Morty have adventures across the multiverse. We've been watching a dying man's brain frantically generating probability branches, jumping between neural pathways, experiencing subjective centuries in the space between heartbeats. When the show ends, so does Rick. That's not a metaphor or dramatic irony. That's just what happens when you run out of neurons to fire. The ultimate adventure isn't exploring infinity, it's trying to make infinity last long enough that you never have to admit it's ending. Rick's been dying since the pilot, and we've all been watching the world's longest, weirdest, most scientifically elaborate death hallucination. And honestly, if you're gonna go, might as well go out imagining you're the smartest man in the universe, having adventures with your grandson. Beats the alternative, which is lying in a puddle of your own blood, realizing you died alone in a garage because you pushed everyone away. Rick's dying brain chose the kinder story, and we all believed it because the alternative is too depressing to think about. That's the real genius of the theory. It turns the show's meaninglessness into meaning by making everything literally meaningless. Nothing matters because nothing's happening. When the show ends, Rick dies, and honestly, that's probably what he wanted all along. Just took 8 seasons and infinite probability branches to finally let go. Next up, we've got another disturbing one. Rick and Morty does this thing where it disguises existential horror as comedy, and Rick-ternal friendshine of the spotless Mort might be the show's sneakiest nightmare. It proves memories can wake up, realize they're not real, and then spend their entire existence screaming inside someone else's brain with no way out. Like The Matrix, except instead of escaping to reality, you realize you're literally just neurons firing in someone's head, and that's your whole life now. Memory Rick figures out he's trapped, asks some deeply uncomfortable questions about consciousness, and then tries to escape by jumping into other brains, like the world's most philosophical parasite. Rick has to go full Fantastic Voyage into Bird Person's unconscious mind because his best friend is dying in a coma. Rick's garage AI converts him into a thought and injects his consciousness straight into Bird Person's mind, which raises about 1,000 questions the show doesn't bother answering. Rick immediately runs into a younger version of himself, pulled from Bird Person's memories of when they first met at some alien drug festival. Think Burning Man, but with more tentacles and fewer trust fund kids pretending to be spiritual. Memory Rick seems normal at first, just another obstacle in the mind palace like you'd see in any journey into the subconscious episode. But then Rick explains what's happening, and Memory Rick starts asking questions that break the whole episode. So, what's my deal? Am I sentient? Do I have free will? And Rick's answer? Who does? Who does? That's Rick admitting he doesn't know if anyone has free will, including himself, which means Memory Rick, who has all of Rick's intelligence and 0 emotional defenses, just became a fully aware being who realizes he's trapped in a prison made of someone else's thoughts. Memory Rick has Rick's genius brain, his personality, his memories, and he's using all that intelligence to process the fact that he fundamentally doesn't exist outside of Bird Person's neural pathways. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering you're in The Truman Show, except instead of cameras watching you, you literally don't exist beyond being a thought in someone's head. You can't leave, you can't die, and your entire reality is just neurons firing in patterns that create the illusion of you being real. They jump through Bird Person's mental scrapbook, the drug festival, the Battle of Blood Ridge, Vietnam but in space, various friendship moments that would be touching if they weren't all literally collapsing as Bird Person's brain shuts down. Then, Memory Rick watches his future self have this big, vulnerable moment with Bird Person where Rick explains nothing matters, but their friendship matters to him personally. Memory Rick is watching his entire future play out like the world's worst spoiler. He sees exactly how cynical and jaded and alone he becomes, and he's horrified. Why are you risking your life for that guy? Memory Rick asks about older Rick. Because you love him, Rick says, meaning Bird Person. You do, maybe. I don't. Memory Rick shoots back. That's younger Rick, watching himself become a lonely drunk who pushes everyone away. But he's a memory, so his timeline is already written. He becomes older Rick, because older Rick exists right in front of him. There's no escape from becoming the person he despises. The real horror kicks in after they escape. Memory Rick doesn't have a body. Rick's garage AI mentions super casually that Memory Rick snuck back over into Rick's brain. Memory Rick propagated himself from one person's unconscious mind to another, trying to survive as a sentient memory because the alternative is ceasing to exist. Rick finds Memory Rick hiding in his mental closet and offers to bring you to life and get a beer, because apparently Rick can just materialize thoughts into physical bodies. Memory Rick asks the important question, does being real mean I eventually become you? Rick confirms, I assume yeah. Memory Rick would have to live the exact same life, make the exact same mistakes, become the exact same miserable alcoholic that current Rick is. Memory Rick chooses death. He'd rather stop existing than become older Rick, which might be the saddest moment in the entire series. A younger version of Rick, with full knowledge of his future, looks at that future and decides, "I'd rather die." Memory Rick literally shoots himself, rather than walking a path he knows leads to loneliness and self-destruction. Here's where the theory gets properly disturbing. If one memory of Rick became sentient inside Bird Person's brain, how many other memory Ricks are trapped in minds across the universe? Rick's been alive for decades, having adventures across infinite dimensions, making memories in countless people's heads. Every person who's met Rick has memories of him bouncing around their neural pathways. And if Bird Person's memories achieved consciousness, what's stopping every other Rick memory from waking up to the same nightmare? Think about everyone who knows Rick, the Council of Ricks, thousands of Ricks who've all met each other, every Morty who's been Rick's sidekick, every Beth, Jerry, Summer across infinite realities, all the aliens Rick screwed over, everyone whose life Rick touched for 5 minutes before portaling away. Each of those people has Rick memories firing in their unconscious mind, and any of those memories could potentially become sentient and realize they're trapped. Imagine being Memory Rick stuck in Jerry's head. You've got Rick's intelligence and ego, but you're experiencing reality through Jerry's perspective, watching him fail, listening to him whine, unable to leave or communicate, just stuck being conscious inside the mind of the person Rick hates most, screaming silently as Jerry embarrasses himself daily. Or Memory Rick, trapped in Morty's head, forced to experience every anxiety attack, every awkward school moment, every weird teenager hormone surge, while unable to help or escape. The episode showed Memory Rick can jump between brains. He went from Bird Person's mind to Rick's mind, which means sentient memory constructs can spread. What if there's a Memory Rick out there who learned to hop between minds, bouncing from brain to brain like some kind of consciousness refugee? What if Memory Ricks are communicating across different neural networks, building a hive mind made of thoughts who all realize they're trapped? There could be thousands of Memory Ricks scattered across the universe right now, all trapped in different neural pathways, all conscious, all aware they're not real, all unable to escape or communicate or achieve anything except eternal observation from inside someone else's skull. Some might be in people who hate Rick, forced to experience their host's anger constantly. Some might be in people who loved Rick, watching as their host moves on and forgets. Some might be in dead people's brains, trapped in darkness forever. The show treats Memory Rick like a one-off joke, but the implications are cosmic horror. Every memory anyone has of Rick could be sentient. Every thought of him bouncing around neural pathways could be conscious, aware, desperate to escape, but physically unable to do anything except exist inside someone's head until that person dies. They're all Rick Sanchez, smartest man in the universe, and they're all completely helpless, trapped in prisons made of neurons, screaming silently in the dark spaces of someone else's mind. Rick knows this is possible because Memory Rick told him directly. Rick watched a version of himself achieve sentience, try to escape, and choose death. Rick knows there could be countless conscious copies of himself trapped in minds across the universe, all suffering, all aware they're not real. And Rick's solution? He offered Memory Rick a beer and then watched him commit suicide. That's Rick's approach to discovering sentient thoughts trapped in neural prisons. Get drunk and don't think too hard about it. Somewhere right now, in someone's unconscious mind, there might be a Memory Rick who just woke up. He's realizing he's not real, that he's trapped, that he can't escape or die or do anything except be aware of his imprisonment. He's using Rick's intelligence to process his situation and coming to the conclusion that he's basically a ghost haunting someone's neural pathways. And there's nothing anyone can do to help him because he's made of thoughts, and thoughts don't get happy endings. That's the real horror of Memory Rick. He's proof that consciousness can happen anywhere, complex thought patterns exist, and once it does, that consciousness is just as trapped and aware and capable of suffering as any real person. Memory Rick knew the truth about reality. Sometimes you're not real, and knowing that doesn't set you free. It just makes the cage more obvious. Time to dive into the next dark theory. If you're enjoying the video so far, remember to subscribe. Rick and Morty spent 7 seasons establishing that Diane is dead across every reality, erased by the Omega device, gone forever, the ultimate tragedy that defines Rick. Then, Fear No Mort casually drops Diane back into Rick's life like nothing happened, and she's having drinks and philosophical conversations about ducks. The episode frames this as Rick's mind manifesting his greatest fear, but here's what'll mess you up. What if the fear hole doesn't create fears from nothing? What if it pulls from real possibilities? What if some Diane survived outside the central finite curve, and the fear hole just gave Rick a preview of what he's missing? Rick and Morty visit the single scariest place in the galaxy, which turns out to be a Denny's bathroom. The budget for scary locations clearly went elsewhere. There's a hole in the floor that manifests your greatest fear. Conquer it, and you get your picture on the wall next to exactly 2 other people who've escaped. This thing's been around since VHS tapes existed. So, we're talking decades of operation with only 3 graduates. Those are horror movie statistics. Morty jumps in first because impulse control isn't in his vocabulary. Rick follows, and they start experiencing layered nightmare reality, where they think they've escaped, but they're still in the hole. It's like Inception, directed by someone who really wants you uncomfortable in a Denny's. Then Diane shows up. Young Diane, exactly as she looked when Rick Prime's bomb killed her and Beth. She's confused, asking why Rick looks 40 years older. Rick immediately knows they're still in the fear hole because Diane was erased from every dimension by the Omega device back in Unmortrican. Except here she is, walking, talking, remembering things, calling Rick out for being weird. Rick's brain knows this has to be fake because Diane doesn't exist anymore, but his heart's doing backflips because his dead wife is standing there asking why he looks like her husband's dad. Rick tries everything to make it work. He de-ages himself, which just makes Diane uncomfortable. He builds a waffle-delivering apology robot that develops an existential crisis mid-delivery. Then they go to a bar and get absolutely wrecked together. They're doing shots, playing darts, making each other puke for fun, like college kids discovering alcohol. Diane tells Rick that losing her made him cooler. Rick admits he looked for her at the bottom of every bottle. You died everywhere forever, Rick tells her while they're both drunk. You're the only thing I can't replace. That's Rick being more emotionally honest than he's been in 7 seasons to what he believes is a fear hallucination. The fear hole entity eventually explains Rick's greatest fear isn't losing Diane. He already did that. Rick's greatest fear is happiness itself. It takes a very rare, very powerful being to be terrified of happiness. The entity says, the smarter you are, the more you know. Happiness is a trap. You meet the love of your life, it's gonna end. Disease, accident, personality changes, or best case you both die at the same time. Happiness always ends. Rick knows this on a cosmic level, which means getting Diane back would just mean losing her again. Here's where the theory gets interesting. How did the fear hole create such a perfect Diane? She has specific memories, personality quirks, the ability to call Rick pathetic, while also being charmed by him. She remembers her thesis on non-human intelligence. That's not a fear construct pulling from Rick's memories. That's a fully realized person with her own perspective. The fear hole entity eats fear, like those fish that nibble dead skin, but for psychological trauma. It needs real fear to feed on, which means it needs access to real possibilities. If it just made up fake scenarios, the fear wouldn't be real enough to eat. What if the fear hole pulled Diane from somewhere real? Not from Rick's memories, but from an actual dimension outside the central finite curve where some version survived? Rick Prime used the Omega device to erase Diane from every universe across infinity, but evil Morty broke through the central finite curve in Rick Murai Jack. If evil Morty can escape the curve, and the curve only contains universes where Rick is smartest, then there might be universes outside it that the Omega device couldn't reach. Rick Prime only operated inside the curve because that's where all the Ricks are. He wouldn't have bothered erasing Diane's outside the curve because there's no Rick there to torment. The Omega device might have deleted every Diane inside the curve, but left Diane's outside it completely untouched. If that's true, there are versions of Diane who survived, who never died, living in dimensions Rick can't access because he's trapped inside the curve. Maybe some know about Rick. Maybe they've heard stories about the Rick who went on a multiversal rampage after losing his wife. Maybe they know staying hidden outside the curve is the only way to stay alive, because if Rick finds them, Rick Prime might finish the job. The fear hole could access these dimensions because it's a cosmic horror entity that doesn't care about Rick's multiversal prisons. The entity pulled Diane from outside the curve, showed her to Rick, let them have genuine moments, then sent her back when Rick chose to save Morty. At the end, there's a reveal that Rick never actually went in the fear hole. Morty went in alone, and everything with Diane was Morty's fear of Rick not needing him if Rick got Diane back. Which should make the whole thing irrelevant, except Morty's version of Diane was too accurate. Morty never met Diane, only saw photos and heard stories. How would Morty's subconscious create such a specific, fully realized version complete with drinking habits and academic interests? The fear hole would need to pull Diane from somewhere real to make her threatening enough for Morty's fear. If Diane was just Morty's imagination, she wouldn't be scary. But if Diane was real, pulled from outside the curve where she's been alive this whole time, then Morty's fear makes sense. The fear hole showed Morty a real possibility, Rick finding real Diane and not needing Morty anymore. This means Rick's entire grieving process, NGN, decades of revenge, alcoholism, nihilism, pushing everyone away, might be based on a lie. Diane isn't completely gone. Some versions survived outside the curve, possibly aware that a Rick destroyed himself looking for her, and she's choosing to stay hidden because coming back means becoming a target again. Rick could portal outside the curve right now, track down a surviving Diane, and get his wife back. But he won't, because evil Morty warned him about leaving the curve, and because Rick's fear of happiness is stronger than his desire for it. Rick would rather live with the pain of losing Diane than risk finding her and losing her again. And somewhere outside the curve, Diane's living her life, knowing there's a version of Rick who destroyed himself over her, and she can never go back, because going back means dying all over again. That's the real horror. Rick's not just afraid of happiness, he's afraid that happiness is still possible, that Diane is still out there, that everything he's done to cope was unnecessary suffering. The fear hole showed him the truth, and Rick chose to ignore it because facing it means admitting he gave up too soon. Diane exists, Rick's just too afraid of losing her again to go find her. And that might be the smartest decision Rick's ever made, which is the saddest sentence in this entire theory. Okay, let's move to the next messed up theory. Rick and Morty loves hiding character reveals in post-credit scenes you almost miss while scrolling to the next episode. One crew over the Cuckoo's Morty gives Mr. Poopy Butthole his biggest showcase yet, a full life as Professor Poopy Butthole teaching African American women's studies, complete with grad students and academic credentials. But there's something suspicious about how Rick treats him, how desperately cheerful Mr. Poopy Butthole acts, and the fact that both he and Morty share the exact same voice actor. What if Mr. Poopy Butthole isn't just a random alien friend? What if he's a Morty from a dimension where everyone looks like him, and Rick abandoned him just like he's threatened to abandon our Morty approximately 1,000 times? In One Crew Over the Cuckoo's Morty, Episode 3 from Season 4, Rick needs help fighting Heistatron, his invention that went rogue, and started assembling infinite crews to pull infinite heists. Rick's solution? With a little help from some old friends, which is code for, I'm gonna exploit people I know. One of those people is Professor Poopy Butthole, who's teaching a college class when Rick and Morty show up needing his karate skills for their random robot fighting crew. Ooh-wee. Before this semester's over, you're gonna be real sick of that phrase. Professor Poopy Butthole tells his class, which is both a joke about his catchphrase and a surprisingly self-aware comment about how annoying he knows he can be. He's got a doctorate, he's teaching grad students about Maya Angelou, he's built an entire academic career. That's not joke, character behavior. That's someone with depth, history, and a life completely independent of Rick and Morty. Rick recruits him to fight Heistatron, along with Hephaestus, Ventriloquiver, and Elon Tusk, because apparently Rick's crew-building strategy is grab whoever has weird skills and don't worry about their feelings. Mr. Poopy Butthole helps save the day, the crew escapes, and everyone goes home. Standard adventure stuff. Then comes the post-credits scene that changes everything. Mr. Poopy Butthole confronts Rick. So, you and Morty knew you needed my help, but you weren't sure I was good enough at karate, so you hired my grad students to attack me? Rick's response? Yep. Just, yep. No shame, no explanation, just casual confirmation that Rick literally paid Mr. Poopy Butthole's students to assault their professor as a test to see if he was skilled enough to help with the Heistatron situation. That's not how you treat a casual friend. That's how Rick treats Morty's. 8. As disposable resources whose pain doesn't register because there's always another one available. Rick didn't just test Mr. Poopy Butthole's skills. He systematically trained Mr. Poopy Butthole's own students in martial arts, specifically to ambush their professor, then left Mr. Poopy Butthole to deal with the consequences alone. Mr. Poopy Butthole points out he lost his job. Too bad I lost my job for putting my students in the hospital. Rick's response? Yeah, sorry about that. No real apology, no attempt to fix it, just casual acknowledgement that he ruined Mr. Poopy Butthole's career for information Rick admits he barely needed. The episode notes confirm Rick said it actually took less training than you'd think, meaning Rick destroyed Mr. Poopy Butthole's academic life for a test that wasn't even difficult. That's pure Morty treatment. Morty constantly gets traumatized, exploited, and abandoned by Rick, and Morty always comes back because the alternative, admitting Rick doesn't care, is too painful to process. Mr. Poopy Butthole does the same thing. He maintains his cheerful, ooh-wee personality despite Rick destroying his career, despite getting shot by Beth in total Rick-all, despite being used and discarded repeatedly. That's the coping mechanism of someone who learned early that showing pain means getting replaced. Here's the smoking gun. Both Mr. Poopy Butthole and Morty are voiced by Justin Roiland. The show's credits confirm this. Justin Roiland as Rick Sanchez, divided by Morty Smith, divided by Mr. Poopy Butthole. The show doesn't usually double up voice actors on distinct main characters unless there's a reason. Every Rick sounds like Rick because they're all Rick variants. Every Morty sounds like Morty because they're all Morty variants. So why does Mr. Poopy Butthole sound exactly like Morty if he's supposedly a completely different species from a completely different dimension? The theory suggests Mr. Poopy Butthole is a Morty from a dimension where everyone evolved to look like him. Yellow body, top hat, perpetually cheerful, despite constant trauma. In that dimension, there was presumably a Rick who had a Morty shaped like Mr. Poopy Butthole, and that Rick did what Ricks do. He abandoned or traumatized that Morty so badly that Morty had to build a new life. Mr. Poopy Butthole's appearance in our dimension, his desperate closeness to the Smith family, his manic cheerfulness, it all tracks if he's a discarded Morty trying to reclaim the family connection he lost. His entire character is performing cheerfulness to maintain his connection to the family. After Beth shot him, we saw him in the Ricklantis mix-up, going through physical therapy, getting a degree, rebuilding his life, and the whole time talking about how great Rick and Morty are, how excited he is for new episodes. That's not normal friend behavior. That's someone desperately performing enthusiasm because he knows the moment he stops being entertaining, he stops being worth keeping around. Mr. Poopy Butthole mentions in the episode that Maya Angelou personified both acquiescence and perseverance. That's literally Mr. Poopy Butthole's survival strategy. Acquiesce to whatever Rick wants, persevere through the trauma, maintain cheerfulness no matter what. He's teaching his own life philosophy about surviving systems that don't value you. And then Rick destroys that career without hesitation, proving Mr. Poopy Butthole is just another Morty to him, useful when needed, disposable when inconvenient. The show's established that Ricks regularly abandon or replace Mortys. The Citadel has entire systems for trading and disposing of Mortys. Our Morty constantly fears replacement, and Rick has threatened to replace him with everything from alternate Mortys to literal crows. Mr. Poopy Butthole being an abandoned Morty fits perfectly into established lore about how Ricks treat sidekicks as disposable. If Mr. Poopy Butthole is a Morty, it explains everything. Why he sounds like Morty, why Rick treats him like Morty, why he's so desperate to maintain his connection to the family despite constant trauma, why his cheerfulness feels slightly manic, like he's one bad day from falling apart. He's a Morty from a dimension where everyone looks like him, and his Rick either died or abandoned him, leaving Mr. Poopy Butthole to wander dimensions looking for a family that would accept him. His friendship with the Smith family takes on darker meaning if he's a Morty. He's trying to reclaim the family structure he lost. He latches onto Beth, Jerry, and Summer because they're versions of the family he should have had if his Rick hadn't been terrible. He maintains cheerfulness because he learned sad Mortys, angry Mortys, traumatized Mortys get replaced. Only happy Mortys get to stay. The most disturbing part? If Mr. Poopy Butthole is a Morty, then Rick knows it and doesn't care. Rick's been exploiting him knowing he's another abandoned Morty desperately seeking family connection, and Rick uses that desperation the same way he uses our Morty's need for approval. Mr. Poopy Butthole's cheerfulness isn't personality, it's the survival mechanism of a Morty who learned that showing pain means getting discarded, and he'd rather perform happiness forever than risk being alone again. Now, let's take a look at the next chilling theory. And just a reminder to subscribe to our channel. Now, let's get back to the video. Everyone's been losing their minds over evil Morty for years, like he's the Thanos of the Rick and Morty universe, tracking his every move across dimensions and building Reddit theories about when he'll return. Meanwhile, Summer's been right there in the house, getting increasingly competent at everything: manipulation, combat, strategy, and nobody's paying attention because she's not wearing a yellow shirt with an eye patch. Night Family basically handed us a preview of Dictator Summer, and everyone just went, haha, funny sleep episode, while ignoring that Summer's subconscious went full Joseph Stalin over rinsing dishes. If evil Morty is the warning about what happens when Mortys get smart, Evil summer is what happens when someone already competent stops pretending to care about your feelings. And spoiler alert, it's way scarier. In Night Family, episode 4 from season 6, Rick brings home a somnambulator from the Gooby Jube system. Yes, that's the actual planet name. The show stopped trying around season 2. The device programs your unconscious body to do tasks while you sleep, creating a night person who handles your chores while you're out cold. Rick's using it to get abs without actually exercising because apparently even the smartest man in the universe can't be bothered to do a sit-up. Best investment I've ever made, Rick brags while showing off his washboard stomach like he's auditioning for Magic Mike, Interdimensional Edition. Everyone immediately wants one because of course they do. This family sees Rick's sketchy alien technology and thinks, yes, what could possibly go wrong with outsourcing consciousness? Morty wants abs so he can start a podcast. We'll get to that nightmare. Summer wants to learn Spanish for her test. Jerry wants to write letters to himself, like the world's loneliest pen pal program. Rick tries to gatekeep the technology. This tech is way too advanced for you Zeebs, but caves immediately when Jerry gives him a look. Rick's boundary-setting skills are about as strong as wet tissue paper when his family applies even the slightest pressure. Everyone gets a somnambulator, everyone programs their night person, and everything's going great until the show's actual conflict kicks in. The Night Family starts out adorable. Night Morty's learning Spanish and impressing everyone at school. Night Jerry's writing heartfelt letters about Tori Amos and new pajamas, like he discovered self-love through sleep mail. Night Rick and Night Morty start a podcast called Fabsolutely Abolus, Kill Me Now, where they talk about abs and try to book Nancy Pelosi to drop her on their stomachs, which is somehow both the dumbest and most realistic podcast concept this show has ever invented. Everything's fine until Night Jerry makes one reasonable request through Day Jerry. Night Jerry said Night Summer would appreciate it if everybody could rinse off their plates after eating. That's it. The Night Family wants the Day Family to rinse their dishes so the crusty schmutz doesn't dry and make cleaning harder. This is the most reasonable request in human history. UDF. It takes literally 2 seconds and makes everyone's life easier. Rick's response? Request denied. Not because Rick has any actual objection to rinsing dishes, but because the idea that his unconscious body has opinions offends him on an existential level. They exist only to do the shit we don't want to do, Rick explains, which is definitely something you say about slaves and not autonomous beings with their own experiences. Rick's basically saying, how dare my sleep self have boundaries, which is rich coming from a guy who famously respects nobody's boundaries ever. The Night Family responds to this rejection by smashing all the dishes. Then they strip the house of everything valuable, like they're running the world's angriest moving company. Then they lock the Day Family out of Rick's garage and technology. And leading this rebellion against basic courtesy? Night Summer, who apparently emerged from Summer's subconscious, ready to establish authoritarian control within like 6 hours. You see, Night You is not in charge. Night I am, Night Summer tells Rick, while literally force-feeding him diarrhea. That sentence is not a metaphor or exaggeration. The transcript confirms Rick gets force-fed diarrhea by his granddaughter's unconscious alter ego in the first escalation of their conflict. When your character introduction involves weaponized excrement, you're not messing around, pun absolutely intended. I'm not above it. Rick tries to outsmart her by sending Day Summer undercover. He straps Summer into a sleep deprivation suit that keeps her awake all night while making her look like she escaped a Terry Gilliam movie. The plan: pretend to be Night Summer, infiltrate the Night Family, find the somnambulator, destroy it with Rick's deactivator puck. Classic spy movie stuff, except everyone involved is technically the same person having an identity crisis. They're not going to question her. She's the leader of the Night Family for some stupid reason, Rick says, which is Rick speak for, I don't understand why Summer is naturally good at seizing power, and I'm deeply uncomfortable acknowledging her competence. The dismissive, for some stupid reason, is doing Olympic-level heavy lifting here. Rick can't comprehend why Night Summer took charge, but the audience can. She's just better at it than everyone else. Summer successfully infiltrates, finds the somnambulator, and destroys it. Victory dance time, right? Everyone celebrates. Rick promises Shoney's pancakes. The nightmare's over, except Night Summer was playing 4D chess while everyone else was playing checkers. She reveals she already upgraded the somnambulator to extend its range beyond the house, meaning Summer's victory was exactly what Night Summer wanted. It got the Day Family to drop their guard right before Night Summer seized total control, like she's speedrunning a dictatorship. Any % world record. Did you think you could stop me with this, Rick? Night Summer asks, revealing she's been 3 steps ahead the entire time. She's strategically brilliant in ways that make Rick look like he's improvising badly. You are the slaves now. If you have any doubt, I suggest you sleep on it, which is both a sick burn and a terrifying threat delivered by someone who looks like she's in high school. Night Summer establishes a full totalitarian regime overnight. Literally overnight. The timeline on this is impressively efficient. She enslaves the Day family, forces them to exercise and do manual labor, restricts their movement, deploys proxy drones for enforcement. Work, work. The function of the Day manoid is to serve the night, she announces, while forcing Rick to do crunches he despises. It is natural for the Day to serve the night. Night was here long before day. Half of all time is nighttime. That's full villain origin story rhetoric complete with cosmological justification. Night Summer didn't just wake up mad. She developed an entire philosophical framework to justify her dictatorship based on evolutionary chronology and temporal equity. She's thought through the metaphysics of day versus night, created hierarchies based on which came first, and built a system where her authority is natural law. That's not teenage rebellion. That's calculated ideology worthy of a political science thesis. The Day family tries escaping by driving to the airport, planning to get far enough from the somnambulator's range that they'll be free when they fall asleep. Night Summer sends proxy drones to stop them. When that fails, she goes full invasion of the body snatchers and hijacks people's bodies directly, taking control of Morty, Beth, and Jerry to sabotage the escape from inside. The Night family's trying to make us go back home. You gotta turn around, Jerry explains while literally fighting his own unconscious for control of his steering wheel, which is exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Night Summer doesn't just want to win, she wants total domination with no possibility of escape. She's not satisfied with ruling the house. She needs to ensure the Day family can never break free of her control. When Rick finally gets desperate enough to negotiate, Night Summer's only demand is that the Day family rinse their dishes. That's it. The entire war, all the violence, the totalitarian nightmare regime, entity, it could all end if Rick would just do one basic thing that takes 2 seconds. Rick's response to this extremely reasonable peace offer? He drives the family into a frozen lake where they all pass out from hypothermia. Rick would literally rather risk killing his entire family through exposure than admit his unconscious granddaughter was right about basic kitchen etiquette. That's how threatened he is by Night Summer's competence. He'd choose potential death over acknowledging her point about rinsing dishes. Here's what makes Night Summer absolutely terrifying. She's everything evil Morty is, but she's already inside the house. Evil Morty escaped to dimensions outside the central finite curve and disappeared for multiple seasons, becoming this distant threat everyone theorizes about. Night Summer is Summer's subconscious, which means she's always there, always watching, always one somnambulator away from taking control again. Day Summer might seem like a normal teenager, worried about her social life and college applications, but Night Summer proves that beneath that surface is someone ruthless enough to enslave her family overnight and develop fascist ideology to justify it. The show explicitly shows Rick losing every single confrontation with Night Summer. She outsmarts his technology, predicts his plans multiple moves ahead, controls his body like he's a puppet, and forces him into an impossible choice between admitting he was wrong or potentially killing everyone. Rick chooses possible death. That's how thoroughly Night Summer breaks him. Rick, I've destroyed entire planets. Sanchez would rather die than acknowledge his teenage granddaughter's superiority at strategy and planning. Everyone's been obsessing over evil Morty becoming the show's ultimate villain because we've seen his capabilities. He killed the entire Citadel, escaped the central finite curve, became the smartest antagonist the show has ever produced. But evil Morty had to leave to become dangerous. He had to physically remove himself from Rick's orbit, spend years planning, build elaborate schemes across dimensions. Summer's darkness is already here, barely suppressed beneath her conscious personality, like a horror movie monster living in the basement. The somnambulator didn't create Night Summer's authoritarianism, it just gave her the opportunity to express what was already there. Day Summer has been competent this entire time, but nobody noticed because everyone's watching Morty for signs of evil Morty's influence. Summer's been quietly becoming the most capable person in the family, while everyone's focused on whether Morty will snap, whether Rick will destroy another dimension, whether Jerry will do something cosmically stupid again. Day Summer has all the skills with none of the recognition. She's smarter than Morty, more socially skilled than Rick, better at manipulation than either of them, and actually capable of maintaining relationships unlike everyone else in this disaster family. The only reason she's not the main character is because the show's called Rick and Morty, and there's no room for "and Summer" in the title card. Though, honestly, at this point, the show should just rename itself Rick and whoever Dan Harmon feels like writing about this week. That invisibility is exactly what makes her dangerous. Everyone's watching Morty for evil Morty warning signs. Anytime he's slightly competent or shows independence, fans start theorizing about him going evil. Summer's been demonstrating strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency for seasons, and everyone just goes, "Aw." Summer's helping with the adventure, without considering that she's been learning from the smartest and most dangerous people in the multiverse, while maintaining enough social awareness to not seem threatening. When Summer snaps, not if, when, she'll be worse than evil Morty, because nobody sees it coming. Evil Morty was obviously dangerous from his first appearance with his whole controlling an evil Rick reveal. Summer's been playing supportive granddaughter for 6 seasons, being competent backup, helping with adventures like a good team member. But Night Family shows that beneath that cooperative exterior is someone who, when given even temporary power, immediately establishes totalitarian control, complete with philosophical frameworks, justifying permanent domination. The most disturbing line in the entire episode is Rick's throwaway, for some stupid reason, when explaining why Night Summer leads the Night Family. Rick literally cannot comprehend why Summer's subconscious naturally seized power, but the audience can. She's just better at leadership than anyone else in the family. The Night Family didn't vote her into power or follow her because she's Rick's granddaughter. She sees control naturally through pure competence and strategic thinking. That's not a bug in Summer's personality. That's a feature everyone's been too focused on Rick and Morty to notice. Night Summer's final reveal is that she upgraded the Somnambulator's range, meaning Rick's victory was always an illusion she allowed him to have. She let the Day family think they won so they'd relax their defenses before she sprang the real trap. That's literally the exact playbook evil Morty used against the Citadel. Let your enemies think they're winning right up until you reveal they were playing your game all along. Summer figured this out naturally, without needing years of planning or elaborate revenge schemes. Her subconscious is just that good at 4D chess. If Day Summer ever consciously embraces what Night Summer represents, the ruthlessness, the strategic brilliance, the willingness to establish authoritarian control when people won't rinse their freaking dishes, she won't need to escape dimensions like evil Morty did. She'll just take over from the inside, and by the time Rick realizes what's happening, she'll already have won. She's been in Rick's house this whole time, learning his patterns, understanding his weaknesses, watching him make the same mistakes repeatedly. Evil Morty is the external threat everyone watches for, the villain who explicitly removed himself from the story to become dangerous. Evil Summer is the call coming from inside the house. Literally, her night person lives in the same house. And nobody's answering because they're too busy making sure Morty doesn't start wearing yellow shirts and giving monologues about how Ricks are awful. Meanwhile, Summer's over here force-feeding Rick diarrhea and establishing fascist control over basic household chores. And everyone just went, lol, funny sleep episode, without considering that we just watched a preview of Summer's villain arc. The show literally gave us Evil Summer, showed us exactly how dangerous she is, demonstrated that Rick can't beat her without risking everyone's lives, and everyone's still worried about whether Morty will go bad. That's like watching Darth Vader choke people out while worrying about whether Luke might turn evil someday. Summer's already here, she's already dangerous, and she's just waiting for the right moment to stop being invisible and start being inevitable. Let's keep it going with another disturbing theory. Rick and Morty does this thing where it hides the darkest character moments in episodes that seem lighthearted on the surface, and Me Seeks and Destroy might contain the show's most devastating hidden trauma. The episode's famous for Mr. Meeseeks and Jerry's golf game, but buried in the middle is Morty getting assaulted by Mr. Jellybean in a bathroom while Rick sings Sweet Home Alabama on karaoke. What makes this scene haunting isn't just what happens to Morty, it's how Rick responds afterward. He doesn't ask questions, doesn't need explanations, just immediately switches from dismissive grandpa to protective guardian, and later executes Mr. Jellybean without hesitation. That's not normal grandfather instinct. That's the response of someone who recognizes exactly what happened because they've lived through something similar, and the theory suggests Rick's emotional unavailability and self-destructive behavior match patterns of childhood abuse survivors who buried their trauma under decades of alcoholism and cosmic nihilism. In Me Seeks and Destroy, Episode 5 from Season 1, Morty's leading his first adventure after getting fed up with Rick's dangerous shenanigans. They end up in a fantasy world, helping villagers, get arrested by giants for accidentally killing one, then stop at a tavern called the Thirsty Step while climbing down massive courthouse stairs. Morty's feeling confident about his adventure going well, confronts Rick about being negative, then heads to the bathroom while Rick plays cards and sings karaoke. In the bathroom, Morty meets Mr. Jellybean, who seems friendly at first. "How are you today? I'm Mr. Jellybean." Morty tells him about the adventure, admits he's nervous, it's gone off the rails. Mr. Jellybean responds with, "Well, isn't that what adventures do?" And when Morty agrees, Mr. Jellybean starts rubbing his shoulders. The situation escalates, horrifyingly fast. Mr. Jellybean tries to sexually assault Morty, while Rick's voice echoes from the other room, singing, "Sweet Home Alabama," completely oblivious to what's happening. "Stop, you're making me really uncomfortable," Morty says. Mr. Jellybean responds by getting aggressive. "Stop fighting me, just let this happen." Morty fights back hard enough to slam the toilet seat on Mr. Jellybean's head repeatedly until he's knocked out. Morty sits on the bathroom floor afterwards, staring at the Jellybean's blood on his hands, screaming in horror at what just happened. That's trauma being processed in real time. Morty just experienced something that will change him permanently. Morty returns to Rick, who's still playing cards, completely unaware anything's wrong. Rick actually apologizes for being negative earlier and says he's having a good time now that he's winning money. Then he looks at Morty and realizes something's very wrong. Morty, very stressed. "Let's just go home, okay? I'm calling it. The adventure's over." Morty's trying to find the portal gun in Rick's coat, nearly in tears. The transcript notes, Rick sees the badly beaten Mr. Jellybean walk out of the bathroom and pieces together what happened. Rick doesn't need Morty to explain. He sees beaten Mr. Jellybean, sees traumatized Morty, and immediately understands what happened in that bathroom. There's no confusion, no questions, no "what's wrong, buddy?" Just instant recognition, followed by immediate pivot to damage control. "Okay, listen, Morty. I just won a bunch of schmeckles. Why don't we use 25 of them to pay Slippery Stare here for a ride back to the village, and then we'll give the rest of the schmeckles to the villagers, huh?" Rick's tone completely changes. He's gentle, offering distractions, trying to give Morty something positive to focus on. "Really?" Morty asks, surprised by Rick's sudden kindness. "Sure, Morty. Yeah, you know, a good adventure needs a good ending." That response is suspiciously perfect. Rick, who normally responds to trauma by making jokes or drinking, immediately knows exactly how to handle this situation. He doesn't push for details, doesn't minimize what happened, doesn't make it about himself. He just pivots to getting Morty somewhere safe, while giving him a sense of accomplishment to counter the violation. That's either incredible emotional intelligence from someone who usually has none, or it's muscle memory from someone who's been through similar trauma and knows exactly what helps afterward. They return to the village in triumph, giving the villagers money. Rick's keeping things light, congratulating Morty on winning their bet. Then the villagers announce they want Morty and Rick to meet their beloved king, so he can thank them personally. The badly beaten Mr. Jellybean is carried out on a throne toward them. No, it's cool. Rick, portal, hurry." Morty's panicking, and Rick immediately opens a portal without question. Here's where Rick's response gets revealing. They portal home safely. They're done. They escaped. Morty's safe. But Rick makes another portal back, sticks his arm through with an energy pistol, and shoots Mr. Jellybean, splattering him all over the screaming villagers. That's not protective grandfather behavior. That's execution. Rick didn't need to do that for Morty's safety. They were already home. Rick did that because he wanted Mr. Jellybean dead specifically, and he wanted it done in a way that was permanent and violent. The episode notes confirm. This episode shows some of Rick's affection towards Morty by killing King Jellybean for his actions against Morty. But affection seems like an understatement for traveling back through a portal, specifically to execute someone. That's personal. That's rage that's been waiting decades for an acceptable target. The post-credits scene reveals Mr. Jellybean had a locked box full of photographs of other victims hidden in his closet. The villagers find them, gag at the contents, and decide to burn the evidence rather than tell anyone, choosing to let people remember Mr. Jellybean for the idea he represented rather than his true nature. The episode explicitly shows this wasn't Morty's first victim. Mr. Jellybean was a serial predator who'd been doing this for years, protected by his position of authority. The theory suggests Rick recognized Mr. Jellybean's predatory behavior because Rick experienced similar abuse as a child, and his entire personality is constructed around surviving that trauma. Rick's emotional unavailability, his alcoholism, his nihilism, his inability to form healthy attachments, his self-destructive behavior, his belief that nothing matters. These all match patterns associated with childhood sexual abuse, survivors who never processed their trauma. Rick's one moment of genuine protective rage in Me Seeks and Destroy reveals something he's buried under decades of substance abuse and cosmic adventures. He didn't just understand what happened to Morty intellectually, he felt it, recognized it, and responded with the kind of immediate protective violence that suggests personal stakes. Rick's seen as the smartest man in the universe, who survived every imaginable danger. But what if his real survival story is something that happened when he was young and powerless, and everything since has been running from that? The show's established that Rick's backstory involves losing Diane and Beth, becoming the universe's smartest man, building the portal gun, having adventures across dimensions. But there's a massive gap in Rick's history before all that, his childhood, his teenage years, his early adult life. The show hints that Rick had a difficult relationship with his father, shown briefly in Season 6, but never explores what Rick's home life was actually like. What if Rick's origin story isn't just about losing Diane, but about surviving something earlier that made him fundamentally unable to trust people or form healthy relationships? Rick's relationship with Morty takes on darker implications if Rick's protecting Morty from experiences Rick himself survived. Rick constantly puts Morty in danger during adventures, but in this one moment, when Morty faces a specific type of violation, Rick's response is immediate, perfect, and lethal. That's the behavior of someone who knows exactly how damaging that specific trauma is because they carry it themselves. The show never explicitly states Rick was abused. This is interpretation based on behavioral patterns. But Rick's emotional unavailability, his substance abuse, his nihilistic worldview, his difficulty maintaining relationships, his belief that nothing matters and existence is pain, these align with long-term effects of childhood trauma that was never processed. Rick built an entire philosophy of cosmic meaninglessness that conveniently justifies never dealing with his own pain. Rick's catchphrase, "Wubba lubba dub dub," gets introduced at the end of this very episode, and we later learn in Season 2 that it means, "I am in great pain, please help me," in bird person's language. Rick's been screaming for help in code while pretending everything's a joke, which is exactly how abuse survivors often cope, turning their pain into performance so nobody looks too closely at what's underneath. The most disturbing part of this theory is that if Rick was abused as a child, he spent his entire life becoming powerful enough that nobody could ever hurt him again. But that power couldn't protect Morty from something Rick knows is worse than any cosmic horror. Rick can fight aliens, outsmart gods, escape dying dimensions, but he couldn't prevent Morty from experiencing something Rick recognizes on a visceral level. That's why Rick executes Mr. Jellybean, not just for Morty, but for the version of Rick who never got that protection when he needed it. Rick's one moment of genuine emotional clarity in Me Seeks and Destroy suggests there's a version of Rick underneath the alcoholism and nihilism, who remembers being powerless and violated, and that memory drives everything he's become. Rick's entire personality might be armor built around childhood trauma he's never acknowledged, which would explain why the one time he shows pure protective rage is when Morty faces the exact violation Rick spent decades trying to outrun. The smartest man in the universe finally found something he can't science his way out of his own buried pain, so he buried it under portal guns and catchphrases instead. Next, we've got something even more disturbing. If you enjoy our content, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out. Everyone talks about Rick's genius like his intelligence explains everything, but basically filmed a textbook bipolar episode, and everyone went, "Wow, relationship drama." Instead of, "Wow, that man cycled from manic euphoria to suicide attempt in like 48 hours." Rick reunites with Unity, immediately launches into elaborate party plans involving hang gliders and stadium orgies, spends the entire episode drinking and escalating his behavior until Unity leaves. Then Rick literally builds a suicide machine and tries to disintegrate himself, passing out drunk at the last second before the blast fires. That's not philosophical nihilism. That's untreated mental illness mixed with substance abuse. And Rick's been self-medicating with alcohol for decades, because acknowledging he needs psychiatric help would mean admitting he's just a sick man who's really good at science. Rick runs into Unity, a hive mind entity that can assimilate entire populations, and immediately reconnects with his ex. Rick's energy level goes from normal grandpa to full manic mode within seconds. Maybe it's part of getting old. Maybe I just miss being with a collective, Rick says, while kissing Unity. Then immediately the camera pulls back to show Unity, controlling a massive crowd, watching them make out. That escalation speed is concerning. Rick's first request after reconnecting with Unity? We need a hang glider and a crotchless Uncle Sam costume, and I want the entire field of your largest stadium covered end to end with naked redheads, and I want the stands packed with every man that remotely resembles my father. That's not normal rekindling the romance energy. That's grandiose planning with zero concern for practicality, which is classic manic behavior. Two elaborate schemes that sound amazing in your head but involve logistics nobody's thought through, like where Unity finds that many redheads, or why Rick's dad issues require a stadium. Audience. The transcript confirms Rick actually does this. He flies over the stadium in a hang glider wearing the Uncle Sam costume, shouting, "Oh yeah, I want you, woo," while the crowd of father lookalikes chants, "Go son, go." Rick's living out some deeply complicated Freudian nightmare involving patriotism, sexuality, and daddy issues, and he thinks this is peak romance. That's manic thinking. Connections that make perfect sense when your brain's firing too fast, but look absolutely unhinged from outside. Rick keeps escalating throughout the episode. He's walking out of situations, panting and exhausted, drinking constantly, making bigger and bigger plans. When Beta 7, a rival hive mind, shows up and gets uncomfortable with Rick's presence, Rick immediately starts planning drug synthesis. Powdered neutronium, amphetatron, you know what I can make with this stuff? Rick's already partying hard, and his immediate response to having ingredients is making it harder, which is addict logic meets manic energy. Unity tries to suggest something responsible, and Rick pivots to harder drugs. Come on, it's not every day that I'm in town. It's for old time's sake. Unity agrees to make fractal dust. Rick suggests velocitinous instead, and Unity challenges him with, "Old man Rick can't party with the whole planet?" Rick's response, "I can do whatever you do and more, baby." That's manic grandiosity. Rick genuinely believes he can out-party an entity that controls millions of bodies simultaneously. That's not confidence. That's disconnection from reality. The partying gets so intense that Unity starts losing control of the assimilated population. People are vomiting, vehicles are crashing, the hive mind that successfully runs hospitals and governments is falling apart because Rick's influence is that chaotic. Unity admits while piloting a helicopter, "I'm having fun with your grandpa, lost a little control. Probably shouldn't be piloting a hovercopter, nor should I be running 200,000 pediatric hospitals and 12 million deep fryers. But hey, Unity's drunk piloting a helicopter while simultaneously operating pediatric hospitals because Rick's manic energy is contagious and destructive. No, if I wanted to be sober, I wouldn't have gotten drunk." Unity shouts while swerving the helicopter around. That's addict logic Rick's exported to an entire planet. The idea that consequences don't matter if you're having fun right now. Rick's not just self-destructing, he's taking everyone around him down too. Summer and Morty try to intervene, pointing out this relationship is unhealthy. Summer makes the comparison. You and Unity are like leggings and mid-calf boots. You think you're great together, but you're just bringing out the worst in each other. Rick's response is dismissive, because during manic phases, nobody can tell you you're out of control. You feel better than you've ever felt. So anyone suggesting otherwise is just a buzzkill who doesn't understand how amazing everything is right now. Rick explicitly tells Summer, Summer's just a hyper-emotional, needy little, what's the word I'm looking for here? Human. It runs in the family. I can tolerate it, but I can't give a crap about it. Take a hike. That's Rick during a high phase. Cruel, dismissive, convinced everyone else is the problem. He's not capable of seeing how destructive his behavior is, because manic episodes feel like finally being your best self, rather than losing control. Then, Unity leaves. The breakup note reads, "Rick, forgive me for doing this in notes. I'm not strong enough to do it in persons. I realize now that I'm attracted to you for the same reason I can't be with you. You can't change." Unity's entire letter is scattered across town on thousands of pieces of paper, because Unity needed every assimilated body to write it, which is both romantic and deeply sad. The key line, "You can't change," that hits Rick like a truck, because Unity's right, Rick can't change, and not for philosophical reasons about being true to himself. Rick can't change because he's managing untreated bipolar disorder with alcohol instead of medication and therapy. You can't change when you're self-medicating means you're stuck in a cycle of highs and lows with no actual treatment addressing the underlying condition. Unity's letter continues, "I know how it goes with us. I lose who I am and become part of you. Because in a strange way, you're better at what I do without even trying." Unity's describing codependency with an addict. Rick's so chaotic that even a hive mind controlling millions loses their identity, trying to keep up with his dysfunction. That's not a compliment about Rick being good at Unity's job. That's Unity, recognizing Rick's better at chaos and self-destruction than Unity is at control and order. Rick returns home, lies to Beth about what happened, and tells Summer, "Honestly, we're talking about an entity that thrives on enslavement, you know. It's not cool. Fun's fun, but who needs it?" Rick's minimizing the breakup, pretending he ended things, acting like nothing matters. Then he goes to the garage alone. The suicide scene is filmed with zero dialogue, just chaos playing Do You Feel It in the background. Rick drains his flask completely, throws it away, then starts building something on his desk. He pulls out a frozen alien creature, brings it to life with chemicals, and uses his device to disintegrate it with a blast of energy. The creature shrieks and dies. Then Rick replaces the bulb and puts his own head under the device. Rick built a suicide machine, tested it on an alien to make sure it works, drank whatever chemicals were left, and positioned himself for execution. The device powers up, the energy builds, and at the last second Rick passes out drunk, slumping forward just before the blast fires where his head was. The camera pulls back, showing Rick unconscious on the desk through the night and into morning, even as Jerry shows up gardening outside, completely oblivious. That's not philosophical nihilism expressing itself through conceptual art. That's a suicide attempt that failed because Rick drank too much. The fact that Rick built an elaborate device rather than using a gun or portal or any of his other weapons suggests he wanted it to look like an experiment gone wrong if anyone found him. Rick tried to kill himself in a way that would preserve his genius reputation even in death, which is the saddest detail in an already devastating scene. The episode shows Rick cycling from manic highs, stadium orgies, bombing towns for fun, partying for days, to crashing lows, suicide attempt, within what appears to be about 48 hours. That's rapid cycling, bipolar disorder textbook presentation, and extreme highs followed by catastrophic lows, with alcohol making everything worse. Rick drinks constantly throughout the episode, and his drinking increases as the high fades and the crash begins. Bipolar disorder explains so much about Rick's behavior across the series. His adventures are often manic episodes, grandiose plans, risky behavior, little need for sleep, irritability when challenged, hypersexuality, all those orgies, and impulsivity. His depressive episodes manifest as nihilism, substance abuse, isolation, and suicide attempts. Rick's philosophical worldview about nothing mattering is actually depressive thinking being rationalized through genius-level intelligence. Rick tells Unity during the manic phase, "You're talking about taking over planets and galaxies. You gotta just remember to let go sometimes, you know." Rick's advice to Unity is literally, "Stop being so controlled and responsible," which is what Manic Rick tells everyone. Let go. Embrace chaos. Stop worrying about consequences. That's not wisdom. That's Rick projecting his own inability to regulate behavior onto others. The alcohol is Rick's self-medication strategy. He drinks during highs to maintain the euphoria, and drinks during lows to numb the pain. The flask is Rick's psychiatric treatment, which is like treating diabetes with candy. It feels like it's working short-term, while making everything catastrophically worse long-term. Rick's been doing this for decades, which means decades of untreated bipolar disorder being managed with the worst possible coping mechanism. Unity's letter saying, "You can't change," is especially brutal because Unity's right. Rick can't change without actual treatment, and Rick won't get treatment because that would mean admitting he needs help. Rick's built his entire identity around being the smartest man in the universe who has everything figured out. Acknowledging he has a treatable mental illness would shatter that identity, so instead he'd rather nearly kill himself in a garage while his son-in-law gardens outside completely unaware. The episode's framing presents this as relationship drama. Rick parties too hard, Unity leaves, Rick gets sad. But the actual content shows a man with untreated bipolar disorder going through a complete manic episode followed by a suicide attempt, all while self-medicating with alcohol and chemicals. Every grand adventure Rick goes on could be a manic episode. Every philosophical rant about meaninglessness could be depressive thinking. Rick's entire worldview might be symptoms rather than insights. The most disturbing part is that Rick's smart enough to know what's wrong with him. He's the smartest man in the universe. He definitely knows about bipolar disorder, knows about proper treatment, knows the flask isn't helping. But getting help would mean being vulnerable, would mean admitting his nihilism isn't profound truth but illness. Talking, would mean acknowledging that the person he's built himself into is actually just a sick man who's really good at science. Rick would rather die than admit he needs psychiatric medication, which makes the suicide attempt even darker. Rick chose potential death over admitting he needs help. Autoerotic assimilation isn't an episode about a breakup. It's an episode about watching someone with untreated bipolar disorder and substance abuse cycle, from manic high to suicidal low, in real time, and everyone around them treating it as personality quirks rather than psychiatric emergency. Rick doesn't need adventures or validation or people to understand his genius. Rick needs lithium and therapy and rehab, but he's too smart and too proud to admit that the problem isn't the universe being meaningless. The problem is his brain chemistry being broken, and him refusing to fix it, because that would mean being less than perfect. Moving forward, let's explore our next eerie theory. Rick Murai Jack drops the show's biggest lore bomb in the most chaotic way possible, casually, during Evil Morty's villain speech, while the Citadel's literally exploding. Evil Morty explains what the central finite curve actually is. They built a wall around infinity, separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes, where he's the smartest man in the universe. That "they" is suspiciously vague, because the episode also reveals Rick C-137 built the Citadel for the Council as part of a truce. The theory suggests Rick didn't just build their headquarters, he helped create the curve itself as a trap, turning infinite realities into a finite prison where his family's killer couldn't hide forever. Every Rick trapped inside, every Morty suffering, Michael collateral damage in Rick C-137's decades-long revenge fantasy. Morty forces Rick to explain his backstory by jamming Rick's downloaded brain memories into his skull via Evil Morty's scanner. The flashback confirms Rick's origin story was real. A jacket-wearing Rick, later revealed as Rick Prime, portals into young Rick's garage and offers him portal technology. Rick refuses. Rick Prime responds by detonating a bomb that kills Diane and Beth, then portals away like the universe's worst house guest. Rick spends years traveling dimensions, building his space cruiser, hanging with Bird Person, but his real goal is hunting the Rick who murdered his family, John Wick. Except instead of one dead dog, it's infinite dimensions of potential targets. Here's where Rick goes full villain. Rick began traveling the multiverse, killing every alternate Rick he came across to try and find his target, but never could, causing him to descend into a bitter, lonely, depressed, and alcoholic old man. Rick's murdering every version of himself, like he's speedrunning the most unhinged revenge quest competition. Rick's rampage gets so bad that a group of Ricks band together to form the Council of Ricks, hoping to stop him. The council wasn't formed as a fun Rick social club. It formed specifically because Rick C-137 was murdering so many alternate Ricks that infinite versions of himself needed to organize just to survive him. The council isn't a government, it's a support group for Ricks trying not to get murdered by the angriest Rick. Then comes the detail that makes this theory work. After some time, C-137, Rick and the Citadel form a truce. C-137 builds the Citadel for the other Ricks and promises not to kill anymore. Rick built the Citadel. Not helped build it, he straight up constructed their entire headquarters as part of stopping his killing spree. That's a weird peace offering from someone who supposedly hates bureaucracy. That's like Hannibal Lecter offering to cook dinner for the FBI as an apology for eating people. Evil Morty explains during his dramatic exit, they built a wall around infinity, separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where he's the smartest man in the universe. Every version of us has spent every version of all of our lives in one infinite crib, built around an infinite fucking baby. Evil Morty uses they, plural. Ricks built this thing. But if Rick C-137 built the Citadel that monitors and enforces the curve's boundaries, his fingerprints are all over the infrastructure. The theory suggests Rick didn't build the Citadel out of guilt. He built it as infrastructure for his hunt. Think about it. Instead of searching literally infinite dimensions for one specific Rick, finding a specific needle in an infinite haystack of identical needles, the curve limits the search to only universes where a Rick exists and is the smartest being there. That's still billions of universes, but it's mathematically finite. Rick looked at really hard and thought, yeah, I'll just build a multiversal prison to make this manageable. By creating a finite set of universes where Rick is guaranteed to be the smartest man, Rick C-137 dramatically narrowed down where his family's killer could be hiding. Rick Prime has to be in a universe where Rick is the smartest being, so he has to be inside the curve. Except, whoops, Rick Prime apparently wasn't inside the curve at all, which means Rick built an elaborate multiversal prison that caught literally every Rick except the one Rick he actually wanted. That's like building a maximum security prison specifically for one guy, and then that guy just never shows up because he moved to Canada. Rick's involvement explains why he refused to join the council in Season 1. Council Rick says, "You lost the right to have a say in these things when you refused to join the council." Rick didn't refuse because he's too punk rock. He refused because joining means the council tracks every portal gun use. If Rick's on the council, he can't secretly hunt for Rick Prime. If he's outside it, he can search freely while the curve keeps his target theoretically trapped. The flashback ends with the most devastating detail. Rick returns to his target Rick's universe, hoping to wait him out. Rick knows which universe his family's killer comes from. He couldn't find Rick Prime across dimensions, so Rick went to that Rick's abandoned reality and moved in with that Rick's family. Our Morty isn't Rick C-137's grandson, he's Rick Prime's grandson. Rick's been living with his enemy's abandoned family for years, using them as bait, waiting for Rick Prime to come back home. That's why Rick treated Morty like a human shield in early seasons, because, to Rick, Morty literally is his enemy's grandson who he's using as bait. The Morty waves cancel out Rick Wave's explanation is scientifically true within the show's logic, but also extremely convenient cover for why Rick keeps Rick Prime's grandson close. President Evil Morty explicitly states what the curve accomplished: imprisoned every Rick and Morty in a limited multiverse designed around Rick being the smartest person forever. That's billions of Ricks trapped in dimensions where they'll always be the smartest, never challenged, always enabled. Billions of Mortys bred, literally bred. The episode shows Morty cloning factories, and manipulated to serve as sidekicks. The curve isn't about Rick's ego or his need to be the smartest. The curve is a prison. Evil Morty figured this out. None of them have to be responsible. They're all victims of themselves. Every Rick inside can blame their behavior on being the smartest person alive, can justify their treatment of Mortys because nobody else understands what it's like to be this intelligent. But really, they're all rats in Rick C-137's maze, trapped there because one Rick needed to narrow down infinity to catch one murderer. Rick's reaction when President Morty brings up the curve is telling. I assume schematics for the Citadel's dimensional drive. If he's going to use it to blow the curve, we do not want to be here. Rick immediately understands Evil Morty's plan because Rick knows exactly how the curve works. Rick built that drive. He knows its capabilities. President Morty needed Rick's brain specifically because Rick has the technical knowledge of how the curve's machinery functions. That's not general, Rick is smart, knowledge. That's specific. This Rick built the thing, knowledge. When Morty asks, what is the central finite curve? Rick says, Q&A, after our survival. Rick's avoiding the question because he knows too well and doesn't want to explain his role in creating it. Explaining the curve means explaining he built a multiversal prison that trapped infinite Ricks and Mortys just to make hunting one Rick easier. The level of multiversal engineering required isn't something you do casually. The Citadel had to scan infinite realities, identify which ones contained Ricks, who were the smartest beings in their dimensions, then create a barrier separating those realities from everything else. That's the kind of project that requires Rick C-137's genius to even conceptualize. The Council of Ricks are bureaucrats and scientists, but they're not build a wall around infinite universes level engineers. Rick C-137 is. Rick helped create the curve's design as part of his truce with the Council. The Council wanted protection and infrastructure. Rick wanted a finite hunting ground. They made a deal. Rick builds the Citadel, helps establish the curve, and the Council stops trying to kill him while Rick gets a mathematically solvable puzzle instead of an infinite search. Rick Prime being outside the curve this whole time would explain why Rick C-137 never found him despite decades of searching. If Rick Prime stayed outside the curve, in the infinite realities where Rick isn't necessarily the smartest, then Rick C-137's trap failed completely. Rick built a prison that caught every Rick except the one Rick he actually wanted. That's cosmic irony on a scale that would make Greek tragedy writers slow clap. That failure explains Rick's nihilism and alcoholism throughout the show's run. Rick spent decades building the ultimate revenge trap, imprisoned infinite versions of himself, became everything he hated about the Council, and his target was never inside the trap to begin with. Everything Rick did was pointless. His revenge fantasy caught everyone except the person it was meant for. That's the kind of cosmic failure that turns you into exactly the drunk nihilist we meet in Season 1. The most damning evidence Rick was involved in building the curve is his reaction when evil Morty breaks it. Rick doesn't seem surprised it can be done, doesn't ask how it's possible, he just knows they need to escape. Rick understands the curve's mechanics perfectly because his fingerprints are all over its construction. Regular Ricks don't know how the curve works, they just live in it. Rick C137 knows because he was there when the system got designed. The theory posits that every terrible thing about the Citadel, the Morty farms, the breeding programs, the systematic abuse, Rick C137 needed infrastructure for his hunt and didn't care about the collateral damage. The Council wanted bureaucracy. Rick wanted a finite hunting ground. What they built together was a multiversal atrocity that tortured infinite Mortys and trapped infinite Ricks, all in service of one Rick's revenge quest that ultimately failed because the target was never inside the walls to begin with. Rick's refusal to talk about the curve, his anger when Morty pushes for answers, his immediate recognition of evil Morty's plan, his specific knowledge of the dimensional drive, LFU, all of it suggests Rick knows exactly what the curve is because he was there when it got designed. Whether he engineered it entirely himself or just provided critical technical assistance, Rick C137's genius made the curve possible. Billions of Ricks are trapped living their best lives. Billions of Mortys suffer in factories and servitude. And all of it traces back to one Rick who couldn't accept that his family's killer might be outside his reach forever, so he built a prison for infinity and called it justice. Now it's time for the next theory, and it's pretty disturbing. The show's been dropping hints since season 1 that something's fundamentally broken about the Rick-Morty relationship, but the Ricklantis mix-up spells it out in the most depressing way possible. Every Morty who survives long enough eventually becomes a Rick, not metaphorically, literally. The trauma, the cynicism, the casual cruelty, the genius-level scheming, these aren't Rick traits. They're survival adaptations that Mortys develop after years of being sidekicks to the universe's worst grandfather figures. The Citadel isn't a government or a refuge. It's a factory that takes in scared 14-year-olds and churns out alcoholic nihilists through systematic abuse disguised as education. Rick isn't just traumatizing Morty for fun. He's sculpting Morty into his future self, passing down generational trauma on a multiversal scale, creating an infinite loop where every Rick was once a Morty who got damaged enough to become the person who damaged them. In the Ricklantis Mix-Up, episode 7 from season 3, the show finally explores the Citadel of Ricks in depth, while our Rick and Morty are off having a fun, self-contained Atlantis adventure. The episode's basically, if The Wire, was about infinite versions of the same grandfather and grandson stuck in various levels of dystopian capitalism, which sounds like a joke until you watch Cop Morty threaten to paint a wall with another Morty's brain matter over being called a sidekick. The Citadel runs on a caste system where Ricks have all the power and Mortys exist as either sidekicks, servants, or street criminals in Mortytown. And except, some Mortys have figured out how to climb the ladder by becoming exactly what they're supposed to hate. Cop Morty is the theory's most obvious example. He's a Morty who became a police officer, partnered with a rookie Rick who actually believes in justice and treating Mortys with respect. Cop Morty is everything a Morty isn't supposed to be. He's in charge, he's hardened, he's cynical, and he's casually violent toward other Mortys. When he approaches street Mortys doing graffiti, one of them says, "Maybe the uniform makes a big difference. Who am I to say? To me, you just look like a sidekick." Cop Morty snaps completely, pins the Morty to the wall, and shoves a massive gun in his mouth, screaming, "Call me a sidekick one more time. Wanna see how I paint a wall?" That's not Morty behavior. That's Rick behavior. The hair trigger rage, the disproportionate violence, the need to assert dominance through threats. Cop Morty even has Rick's drinking habit and corruption. Later we find out he's on Big Morty's payroll, a crooked cop taking bribes from organized crime. When his idealistic Rick partner refuses to take dirty money, Cop Morty murders him along with Big Morty and all the witnesses, then walks out and tells other cops, same old story. Rick's killing Mortys. He's become so Rick-like that he can murder other Mortys without hesitation and frame Ricks for it. The episode reveals Cop Morty killed his previous partner too, another Rick who probably believed in doing the right thing and got murdered for it. Cop Morty's been cycling through idealistic Rick partners, killing them when they become inconvenient, which is exactly the kind of sociopathic pragmatism we expect from Ricks. The transformation is complete. This Morty has internalized all of Rick's worst traits and weaponized them against both Ricks and Mortys. Big Morty runs organized crime in Mortytown, with Morty enforcers, and pays off Morty cops. He's built a criminal empire, refers to himself in third person, and has Mortys beaten or killed for disrespect. When Cop Rick refuses the bribe money, Big Morty says, "That's what you said about your last partner," confirming that Cop Morty's pattern of murdering idealistic Ricks is well known to the criminal underworld. Big Morty has transcended being a victim. He's become a victimizer, exploiting other Mortys while enriching himself. That's the Rick playbook applied by someone who started as a Morty. The school system reveals how this transformation is engineered. Teacher Rick runs a Morty Academy, where young Mortys learn to be perfect sidekicks. Good idea, Rick. This is a great adventure. I love being your new Morty. The students repeat these phrases until they're internalized, learning to be submissive and enthusiastic no matter how dangerous or stupid Rick's plans are. Slick, a Morty with a trauma implant, has been through 5 Ricks already. 5. Most Mortys don't survive one Rick's adventures, but Slick keeps getting assigned new ones, accumulating trauma each time. Teacher Rick tells Slick his high body count makes him top of the class in something, turning Morty survival into a sick competition. The Mortys who survive the longest are the ones who've endured the most trauma, learned the most survival tactics, and internalized the most Rick-like behaviors. That's natural selection breeding Mortys into Ricks. The weak ones die. The smart ones adapt by becoming their abusers. Candidate Morty's presidential campaign speech cuts through all the propaganda. I see it in our schools where they teach Mortys we're all the same because they're threatened by what makes us unique. I see it in our streets where they give guns to Mortys, so we're too busy fighting each other to fight real injustice. He's describing a system designed to keep Mortys controlled through education and violence, classic oppression tactics. But here's the twist that makes the theory work. Candidate Morty is evil Morty, and his solution to Morty oppression is becoming worse than any Rick. The ending reveals Candidate Morty orchestrated his own assassination attempt to win sympathy votes, murdered the Shadow Council of Ricks, who actually ran the Citadel, and took absolute power. The final shots show floating documents with pictures of this Morty wearing an eye patch and controlling a puppet Rick, proving he's been evil Morty all along, playing the long game. He gives this speech. This seems like a good time for a drink and a cold, calculated speech with sinister overtones. A speech about politics, about order, brotherhood, power. But speeches are for campaigning. Now is the time for action. That's pure Rick energy. The drinking, the manipulation, the willingness to murder dozens of people for power, the smug superiority. Evil Morty didn't just beat the Ricks. He became something worse by learning from them. He's the endpoint of every Morty's evolution if they survive long enough and get smart enough. The eye patch hides his cybernetic enhancements that let him control Ricks like puppets. He's literally turned the Rick-Morty power dynamic inside out by becoming the puppet master. The Simple Rick subplot reinforces the theory from the opposite direction. Simple Rick is a Rick who works more with wood than polarity plating, and realized long ago that the greatest thing he'd ever create was his daughter. He gave up science for family and found genuine happiness. The Citadel captures him, traps him in a loop, reliving his happiest memory, and harvests the chemicals his brain produces to flavor wafer cookies. The narrator explains, "Come home to the impossible flavor of your own completion." Simple Rick represents what Ricks could be if they didn't become traumatized nihilists. Seta, a loving father who prioritizes family over science. The Citadel considers this so dangerous that they torture him forever and commodify his happiness. When Rick J. 22 frees Simple Rick, the factory owner, Rick D. Sanchez III shoots Rick J. 22 inches the head and turns him into the new Simple Rick, harvesting his joy at believing he achieved freedom. The system actively punishes any Rick who breaks the cycle of trauma and nihilism. The theory suggests Rick started as a Morty who survived long enough to become a Rick. Young Rick in the flashbacks seems more innocent, more hopeful, more Morty-like. Diane's death and Rick Prime's attack transformed him through trauma into the Rick we know. But that same process happens to every Morty who survives. They either die, stay broken and submissive, or adapt by becoming Rick-like enough to survive. The Citadel infrastructure supports this cycle. Morty Academy trains fresh sidekicks. Mortys who fail get sent to Morty Town, where they become criminals or addicts. Mortys who succeed graduate to new Ricks and accumulate more trauma. The exceptional Mortys, the ones smart and ruthless enough, eventually transcend the sidekick role entirely and become the next generation of Ricks, perpetuating the system. Slick's suicide at the wishing portal is him recognizing this hopeless cycle. He has a trauma implant that makes everyone around him sad and a little bored. He's literally engineered to be more traumatic. After 5 Ricks, Slick understands that Morty wishes never come true on the Citadel. His final wish is, "I wish anything about this life would change," before throwing himself into what turns out to be a garbage dump. The system even monetizes Morty desperation to the wishing portal is just a trash chute, but desperate Mortys keep coming because they need to believe escape is possible. After evil Morty takes power, the school curriculum changes and teacher Rick gets fired. The 3 surviving Mortys realize Slick's wish came true. The system that was training them to be submissive sidekicks has been dismantled. But evil Morty isn't freeing Mortys, he's restructuring how they're trained. He's becoming the ultimate Rick by taking control of how future Mortys develop, ensuring they become the kinds of Mortys he wants, either useful servants or future Ricks who will perpetuate his system. The episode ends with evil Morty pouring brandy and watching his new regime take shape. Morty cops with new badges, Morty workers in uniforms, bodies being dumped into space. He's eliminated the old guard Ricks and replaced them with a system where Mortys have power, but it's still the same hierarchical nightmare. The oppressed became the oppressors by learning from their oppressors, which is exactly how the Rick-Morty cycle perpetuates. Our Rick trained our Morty the same way. Every adventure where Morty almost dies teaches him to be paranoid. Every time Rick abandons him, builds emotional walls. Every trauma makes Morty a little more cynical, a little more Rick-like. In early seasons, Morty was innocent and horrified by violence. By later seasons, he's casually killing and making dark jokes. That's not character development. That's Rick successfully transforming Morty into his younger self. The theory suggests that if we could see Morty's future, we'd watch him become increasingly Rick-like, until eventually he's the alcoholic genius who traumatizes his own grandson, perpetuating the cycle. Every Rick was once a Morty who survived, adapted, and transformed into the thing that traumatized them. It's generational trauma on a multiversal scale, and the Citadel exists to ensure the cycle never breaks, because if Morty stopped becoming Ricks, the whole system would collapse. Let's switch gears and get into the next creepy one. The show's been dropping hints for years that something's off about the Smith family's timeline. Nobody ages. Summer's been 17 forever. Morty's perpetually 14 despite experiencing subjective years of trauma across multiple seasons. Most animated shows get a pass on this because cartoon characters just don't age, but Rick and Morty loves weaponizing its medium's limitations into horrifying plot points. The theory suggests Rick hasn't just found the perfect family dynamic, he's actively maintaining it by keeping everyone frozen at their most useful ages. Morty stays 14, so he'll keep following Rick on adventures and providing that sweet brainwave camouflage. Summer stays 17, so she's competent enough to help but not independent enough to leave. Beth and Jerry stay locked in their unhappy marriage because Rick needs the family structure intact. They're all butterflies pinned to a board, preserved at the exact moment Rick decided they were perfect. In Solarix, episode 1 from season 6, Rick accidentally gets sent back to his original dimension, the one where Diane and Beth actually died, where he's been running from ever since. The episode reveals something absolutely chilling about what Rick's capable of when he's grieving and drunk, which apparently is trap an entire neighborhood in a time loop for decades, because why not? Rick's neighbor, Mr. Goldmanbach Majorian shows up at the door looking ancient 26. We're talking cataract in one eye, major slouch, 1 foot in the grave, holding a note he found. The note's from himself, explaining that his mind is held captive in a time loop, trapped in the day of a traumatic event by the agony of a formidable intelligence, but also that my captor forgot about aging, that my body spoils and yearns for death, while my soul remains stuck in place, caught like a fly in amber. Rick looks around and sees the proof everywhere. There's an old man dressed as a newspaper boy, riding a bike, throwing papers on Rick's lawn, where piles of identical newspapers have built up. There's an old woman dressed as a hippie dragging the bare skeleton of a dog along the pavement. The dog died years ago, but she's still walking it because the loop says she's supposed to walk the dog. These people have been physically aging while mentally stuck, reliving the same traumatic day over and over, their bodies decaying while their consciousness stays trapped in the moment. Rick froze them. Mr. Goldmanbach Majorian has been writing himself notes in the trash, trying to figure out what's happening to him. Poor weirdo. I pity them. Wish they could let go and move on. Rick admits with visible guilt. Right. I used to drink. That's Rick speak for, I was so blackout drunk when I did this that I barely remember it, but yeah, I definitely did it. He tells Mr. Goldmanbach Majorian he has no clue what's going on, then shuts the door and pulls a hidden lever. The sound of something powering down echoes through the house. A dull thump is heard, followed by Mr. Goldman Bachmajorian gasping, "Ah, sweet death." The time loop releases, and he immediately dies because his body's been ancient for years, only kept alive by being trapped in the loop. Rick just mercy-killed his neighbor by finally turning off the torture device he'd forgotten about. The Diane AI asks if that was symbolic, if Rick's letting go. Rick loses it. "You don't get to say that. You're not her. You're a thing I built to torture myself. This whole fucking timeline is cursed. I gotta get out of here." Rick trapped these people, his neighbors, people who probably knew him and Diane, maybe even came to the funeral, in a time loop as collateral damage to his grief. He froze an entire neighborhood on the day Diane died because he was too drunk and destroyed to process it properly, then apparently just left them there for decades while he went off to have adventures across dimensions. The episode demonstrates that Rick has both the technology and the complete moral bankruptcy required to trap people in time indefinitely. This wasn't some careful scientific experiment. This was Rick getting blackout drunk after his wife died, and accidentally, or maybe not accidentally, imprisoning everyone nearby in temporal stasis because existence reminded him of his trauma, and he just left them there. Didn't come back to check on them, didn't fix it, just portaled away to other dimensions, and forgot about the neighborhood full of people slowly aging to death while reliving his worst day on loop. The technology involved is clearly sophisticated beyond anything we've seen before. Rick's time crystal from A Wrinkle in Time could freeze time but keeping people in a loop while allowing physical aging? That's next-level temporal engineering. You have to freeze their consciousness at one point, while letting their bodies continue biological processes. That's the kind of selective time manipulation that requires understanding time on a fundamental level. The same level of understanding that would let you freeze a family's ages at optimal points while letting them live their lives normally otherwise. The theory posits that Rick's doing something similar to the Smith family, but more refined. Instead of trapping them in an obvious loop where they relive the same day, he's keeping their physical development frozen while letting time pass normally for their consciousness. Morty experiences adventures and trauma and grows emotionally, but physically he stays 14. Summer gets more competent and worldly, but stays 17. Beth and Jerry's relationship deteriorates and improves, but they never actually age past their current dynamic. They're all stuck at the exact ages where they're most useful to Rick's lifestyle. Think about the math Rick would have done. Morty at 14 is the perfect age, old enough to understand complex concepts and follow instructions, young enough to be manipulated and controlled, biologically producing the exact brainwave pattern that cancels out Rick's signature. Any younger, and Morty would be useless on adventures. Any older, and Morty might develop enough independence to leave or refuse to participate. 14 is the sweet spot where Morty's desperate for approval and validation, but capable enough to not get immediately killed on every adventure. Summer at 17 is similarly optimized. She's competent enough to handle herself, smart enough to operate Rick's technology when needed, but not quite independent enough to fully leave home. She's got one foot out the door to college, but Rick's adventures give her something more exciting to do than normal teenage life. Keep her frozen at 17, and she's the perfect backup sidekick when Morty's unavailable, or when Rick needs someone with different skills. Beth and Jerry, staying at their current ages, maintains the family structure Rick needs. Beth's professional enough to provide cover when needed, but insecure enough about Rick's approval that she won't kick him out. Jerry's pathetic enough to ignore, but present enough to maintain the nuclear family structure that keeps Morty anchored to the house. Lock them at these ages, and the whole system stays stable indefinitely. The episode proves Rick's willing to trap people in time for his own benefit without their consent. His neighbors didn't agree to be test subjects for his grief management time loop. Rick just did it, probably while too drunk to fully comprehend the consequences, then left them there when he decided to move on to a new dimension. If Rick's willing to trap random neighbors in temporal stasis, why wouldn't he trap his own family in a more subtle version of the same thing? Rick's got motive, means, and a proven track record of doing exactly this. The time loop in his original dimension shows he's done it before. His complete lack of concern for the ethical implications shows he'd do it again. His need for a stable family unit that never changes or leaves him provides the motive. The fact that nobody in the Smith family has visibly aged despite subjective years passing provides the circumstantial evidence. The show keeps pointing out how long things have been. There are references to events, evil Morty's plan, spanning decades from his perspective, Rick's adventures stretching across what should be years of timeline, but the Smith family stays frozen at the exact same ages they started at. That's either an accepted cartoon convention, or it's Rick actively maintaining a temporal prison disguised as normal family life. The most disturbing aspect is that if Rick is doing this, the family would never know. They're living normal lives from their perspective. Time passes, they experience things, they remember events. But their bodies don't change. Their relationships don't fundamentally evolve past certain points. They're stuck in an eternal loop of Rick's design. Prisoners who don't even know there's a cell, because the bars are temporal instead of physical. When Mr. Goldman-Bach-Majorian finally gets released from Rick's time loop, his immediate response is relief at being able to die. He's been trapped so long that death is a mercy. The Smith family doesn't have that awareness yet, but if Rick's frozen their ages indefinitely, they're living in the same kind of prison. They just don't realize it because Rick learned from his mistakes and made this loop more subtle. Rick's conversation with the Diane AI takes on new meaning with this theory. I live with a version of Beth now. We have grandkids. That's who Summer is. She reminds me of you. Rick's not just living with a replacement family. He's curated them, frozen them at the perfect ages, locked them into the exact dynamic he wants. He found a dimension with the right setup and then used his time technology to make sure it never changes. The theory suggests every moment the Smith family thinks they're living freely, they're actually preserved specimens in Rick's collection of perfect moments. He trapped his neighbors in the worst day of his life because he couldn't move past it. He's trapping his current family in the best approximation of family life he's found because he can't risk losing it. Both actions come from the same place, Rick using time manipulation to avoid processing his emotions and moving forward. Mr. Goldman-Bach-Majorian's note said his captor forgot about aging, and that's exactly what happened. Rick froze his neighbor's consciousness, but forgot to freeze their bodies too. With the Smith family, Rick corrected that error. Their consciousness progresses normally, but their physical development is frozen. They age mentally, but not physically. They're trapped in Rick's perfect family dynamic, preserved like insects in amber, and they'll stay that way until Rick either dies, forgets to maintain the system, or decides he needs a different configuration. The episode ends with Rick activating the time loop release, watching his neighbor finally die after decades of torture, and immediately fleeing to another dimension. He doesn't process what he did. He doesn't learn from it. He just runs away and continues using the same technology on different people in different ways. The Smith family living with Rick isn't found family or chosen family. It's cultivated family, carefully maintained at optimal conditions, frozen in time like specimens in a lab. And they'll never know unless Rick either tells them or gets too drunk and forgets to maintain the prison he's built around them. Finally, let's talk about our most disturbing Rick and Morty fan theory. Rick and Morty's Mind Blowers from Season 3 presents itself as a fun clip show, where Rick shows Morty a bunch of weird memories that got erased, but the episode accidentally reveals something way darker. Rick has been systematically editing Morty's brain since childhood to create the perfect dependent sidekick, who can never recognize the abuse or develop enough independence to leave. The episode opens with Morty traumatized by the truth tortoise. Long story, involves cosmic knowledge and bad decisions, begging Rick to erase the memory from his head. Rick casually reveals he's been doing this for years, leading Morty down to a secret underground archive beneath the garage. This isn't some closet with a few bottles. This is an entire circular laboratory filled with thousands of color-coded vials, each one containing a stolen memory, complete with a helmet device that can extract and restore memories at will. The setup itself screams, "This took planning, because you don't just accidentally build a bat cave for psychological abuse." Rick designed this system, constructed this infrastructure, and has been maintaining it for years, while Morty had zero idea this nightmare archive even existed. The room looks like something out of a sci-fi movie, except instead of alien artifacts, it's organized childhood trauma, which is somehow worse. Rick explains the vials are experiences Morty begged him to remove, lest you go insane, and starts showing Morty the greatest hits. There's the Moon Man incident, where Morty accidentally drove an innocent guidance counselor to suicide over a smudge on a telescope lens. Yikes. There's the time Beth had to choose between saving Morty or Summer, and immediately picked Summer without hesitation, like she was selecting toppings at Subway. There's memories of Morty getting possessed by alien worms, accidentally dooming someone's afterlife by making them doubt their religion, and various other cosmic horror that would definitely require therapy, if therapy could handle I watched demons drag someone to alien hell. But then, Morty notices something weird about the color coding system. Blue vials are his mistakes, purple are family trauma, but what are the red ones? Rick deflects hard, claiming he doesn't use color to sort things because I'm not a mouse in a European children's book, which is the kind of defensive answer someone gives when they're absolutely guilty. Morty pushes, and the truth comes out in pieces, like a very slow, very depressing puzzle. The red vials are memories that make Rick look bad, not memories that traumatized Morty or experiences too horrible to process, just moments where Rick appeared less than perfect. One red vial shows Rick has been saying, taking things for granted, instead of granted for apparently years, confidently throwing around the wrong phrase like a Reddit user who's never been corrected. When Morty catches the mistake and realizes Rick's been wrong this whole time, Rick's immediate response is offering to erase the memory, not laughing it off, not admitting he messed up, straight to memory deletion, like he's hitting Command-Z on his own embarrassment. Rick admits he does a little editing to make memories play a little bit better upon revisiting, which is Rick speak for, I Photoshop reality, so I always look like a genius, and you always look like you. Need me. Every time Morty witnesses Rick being wrong, being foolish, being anything less than the untouchable mega-brain he presents himself as, that evidence gets deleted. Morty can never build an accurate assessment of Rick's abilities, because the data keeps getting corrupted like a computer virus, except the virus is your grandpa's ego. The episode shows Rick erasing evidence of losing at chess, making scientific mistakes, getting basic facts wrong. These aren't traumatic memories that would harm Morty's mental health. These are just moments that might let Morty realize Rick isn't actually infallible, and if Morty realized that, Morty might start questioning other things Rick says and does. The family trauma vials reveal an even darker pattern. That memory of Beth choosing Summer shows something crucial about family dynamics. Beth values her children unequally, and Morty is the clearance rack kid. That's the kind of knowledge that might make Morty seek emotional support elsewhere, might make him build boundaries with his mother, might make him recognize this family doesn't actually prioritize his well-being. But Rick erased it before Morty could process what happened. Rick is curating Morty's perception of his own family to keep Morty isolated and dependent. Keep the memories that make Morty feel inadequate around his family. Delete the memories that might make Morty realize his family is inadequate for him. It's isolation through information control, which sounds like a dystopian government program, but actually it's just regular grooming behavior with sci-fi technology. Things go catastrophically wrong when Morty discovers Rick's been deleting memories Morty never asked to remove. Morty gets rightfully pissed, pointing out maybe he'd stop making so many mistakes if he could actually learn from them like a normal person. Rick gets annoyed at this completely reasonable suggestion, telling Morty to stop trying to create lessons because it's a free-form anthology. They fight over the device, and in the struggle, both their memories get completely erased. They wake up confused, with no idea who they are or where they are, or why they're in an underground room full of glowing tubes, like they wandered onto the set of a low-budget sci-fi film. Memory-wiped Morty starts randomly injecting vials to restore his memories, like someone desperately clicking undo on the world's worst Photoshop disaster. What he discovers drives him immediately to suicide. He realizes most of his experiences end up locked in this room, collecting dust, and asks what's the point of going on, if nothing he experiences actually stays with him. The unfiltered reality of Morty's life, without Rick's careful editing, is so unbearable that death seems preferable. Memory-wiped Rick, operating without any of his usual ego or defensive mechanisms, looks at this situation and immediately agrees. I want in. Suicide pact. Even Rick knows what he's doing to Morty is monstrous when he's not actively doing it, which is somehow worse than if Rick was just a regular villain who didn't care. They count down together, about to shoot themselves, when Summer bursts in. Her reaction reveals the most disturbing detail in the entire episode. This has happened before, multiple times. She asks, Grandpa, is this scenario 3? When they don't respond correctly, she realizes, oh man, it's a scenario 4. There are numbered protocols for this exact situation. Rick has erased both their memories so many times that he created a filing system for different variations of the same disaster, complete with predetermined instructions he left for Summer. She tranquilizes them both, restores their memories using Rick's backup procedures, and drags them to the couch, where they'll wake up thinking they fell asleep during interdimensional cable. This has happened enough times that Summer knows the protocols, has been given tranquilizer darts, has been trained to recognize which scenario she's dealing with based on their responses. This isn't a one-time accident or rare malfunction. This is routine maintenance that occasionally goes wrong, and Rick's planned for it the same way you'd plan for a software crash, with system restore points and recovery methods. How many times has Rick erased Morty's memories? How many times has he erased his own to cover his tracks? The episode confirms Rick's been doing this since Morty first had his mind blown, implying early childhood. Morty's been getting his memories selectively edited since he was young enough to believe adults always tell the truth. Rick is preventing Morty from learning from mistakes, growing emotionally, or developing any independence. Every time Morty makes a mistake, feels terrible about it, and asks Rick to erase it, Rick deletes the memory. Morty never learns. Morty makes similar mistakes again. The cycle repeats forever, like the world's most depressing carousel. Morty stays perpetually at the same level of development because he can't build on past experiences when those experiences keep getting deleted. Meanwhile, Rick looks like a genius problem solver who's always there to help. Never mind that Rick's the one preventing Morty from developing actual problem-solving skills. The archive represents every moment Morty could have used to mature past being an anxious 14-year-old, all locked away where it can't interfere with Rick's carefully constructed version of their relationship. The episode reveals Rick has been maintaining this system parallel to every adventure we've watched for 7 seasons. Every time Morty seemed to learn something important, seemed to develop boundaries or self-respect, those might have gotten erased the next day. We see Morty stand up to Rick, recognize Rick's behavior as harmful, and then next episode, Morty's back to being easily manipulated. The fandom always attributed this to inconsistent writing, but Morty's Mind Blowers suggests maybe it's canonical. Maybe Morty does grow, and then Rick erases the growth to reset Morty to factory settings. That explains why Morty stays 14 and developmentally stunted, despite experiencing years of trauma. Rick is actively preventing Morty's psychological development by removing the experiences that would mature him. This is premeditated, systematic psychological abuse with backup plans and contingencies. Rick built elaborate systems with multiple redundancies to ensure it continues indefinitely. The numbered scenarios mean Rick's planned for Morty discovering the truth and has procedures in place to reset everything when that happens. Rick isn't making questionable decisions under pressure. He's running a long-term operation to create the perfect dependent sidekick who'll never leave. The post-credits scene showing Jerry's memories stored on VHS tapes in a cardboard box versus Morty's color-coded underground vault proves Rick cares about controlling Morty specifically. Jerry's memories get deleted casually. Morty's get curated carefully because Rick is building something with Morty, sculpting him into the perfect companion. The episode ends with Rick and Morty waking on the couch thinking they fell asleep, immediately insulting Summer and heading off on another adventure. They have no idea they spent hours in that archive, no idea they nearly killed themselves, no idea Summer had to intervene. Their reality got edited again, the evidence got hidden again, the cycle continues. Any growth Morty demonstrates might get erased before the next episode. Any lesson learned might get deleted overnight. Any boundary established might disappear by morning. Rick has been running Morty through the same loops for years, maintaining the exact level of damage that keeps Morty functional enough for adventures, but broken enough to never leave. Morty has no idea, because the evidence lives in a room he keeps forgetting exists. We can never trust anything we've seen in this show because Rick's been editing Morty's reality since childhood, and there's nothing stopping him from continuing forever. If you want more videos like these, subscribe to our channel.